You can fast forward to 44 seconds if you'd like to skip the intro. If you haven't already heard my introduction for the first book of the Discourses, I'm a little confused. Not a whole lot, because, due mainly to my having a cold, book 1 didn't sound all that great, but a little. Not that it matters, because I didn't make this video for you. I made it for me, because I wanted to practice reading aloud. I'm getting there. Slowly. Without further ado, the Discourses on the second book of Titus Livy. Read about as fast as I physically could, because slowly is a relative term. The Discourses by Niccolo Machiavelli. Translated by Leslie J. Walker. Published by Penguin Classics. Book 2. The Growth of Rome's Empire. The Preface. Men always, but not always with good reason, praise bygone days and criticize the present, and so partial are they to the past that they not only admire past ages the knowledge of which has come down to them in written records, but also, when they grow old, what they remember having seen in their youth. And when this view is wrong, as it usually is, there are, I'm convinced, various causes to which the mistake may be due. The first of them is, I think, this. The whole truth about olden times is not grasped, since what redounds to their discredit is often passed over in silence, whereas what is likely to make them appear glorious is pompously recounted in all its details. For so obsequious are most writers to the fortune of conquerors, that in order to make their victories seem glorious, they not only exaggerate their own valorous deeds, but also magnify the exploits of the enemy, so that anyone born afterwards, either in the conquering or in the conquered province, may find cause to marvel at such men in such times, and is bound, in short, to admire them and to feel affection for them. Another reason is that, since it is either through fear or through envy that men come to hate things, in the case of the past, the two most powerful incentives for hating it are lacking, since the past cannot hurt you nor give you cause for envy, whereas it is otherwise with events in which you play a part and which you see with your own eyes, for of these you have an intimate knowledge and are in touch with every detail, and in them find mingled with the good also much which displeases you, so that you cannot help thinking them far inferior to the remote past, even though, in fact, the present may be much more deserving of praise and renown. I am not here referring to what pertains to the arts, for in themselves they have so much luster that time can scarce take away or add much to the glory which they themselves deserve. I am speaking of things appertaining to human life and human customs, the evidence for whose merit is not so clear to one's eyes. My answer is, then, that it is true there exists this habit of praising the past and criticizing the present, and not always true that to do so is a mistake, for it must be admitted that sometimes a judgment is valid, because, since human affairs are ever in a state of flux, they move either upwards or downwards. Thus one sees a city or a province that has been endowed with a sound political constitution by some eminent man, thanks to its founder's virtue, for a time go on steadily improving. Anyone born in such a state at such a time is wrong if he gives more praise to the past than to the present, and his mistake will be due to the causes we have mentioned above. But those who are born in this city or province later on, when there has come a time in which it is on the decline and is deteriorating, will not then be in error. When I reflect that it is in this way that events pursue their course, it seems to me that the world has always been in the same condition, and that in it there has always been much good as there is evil, but that this evil and this good has varied from province to province. This may be seen from the knowledge we have of ancient kingdoms, in which the balance of good and evil changed from one to the other owing to the changes in their customs, whereas the world as a whole remained the same. The only difference was that the world's virtue first found a home in Assyria, then flourished in Media, later in Persia, and at length arrived in Italy and Rome. And if, since the Roman Empire, there has been no other which has lasted, and in which the world's virtue has been centered, one none the less finds it distributed among many nations where men led virtuous lives. There was, for instance, the kingdom of the Franks, the kingdom of the Turks, i.e. that of the Sultan, and today all the peoples of Germany. Earlier still, there were the Saracens, who performed such great exploits and occupied so much of the world, since they broke up the Roman Empire in the East. Hence, after ruin had overtaken the Romans, there continued to exist in all these provinces and all these separate units exists, and still exists in some of them, that virtue which is desired and rightly praised. If, then, anyone born there praises the past over and above the present, he may well be mistaken. But anyone born in Italy who has not come at heart to an ultramontane, or anyone born in Greece who has not yet become at heart a Turk, has good reason to criticize his own times and to praise others, since in the latter there are plenty of things to invoke his admiration, whereas in the former he comes across nothing but extreme misery, infamy, and contempt. For there is no observance either of religion or of the laws or of military traditions, but all is besmirched with a filth of every kind, and so much the more are these vices detestable when they are more prevalent among those who sit on the judgment seat, prescribe rules for others, and expect from them adoration. But to return to our main point, I maintain that if a man's judgment is biased when he tries to decide which is the better, the present age or some past age of which he cannot have so perfect a knowledge as he has of his own times, precisely because it is long since past, this ought not to bias the judgment of old men when they compared the days of their youth with those of their old age, for of both they have had the same knowledge and experience. Nor would it, in point of fact, if during the various phases of their lives men judged always in the same way and have had the same appetites. But as men's appetites changed, even though their circumstances remain the same, it is impossible that things should look the same to them, seeing as they have other appetites, other interests, other standpoints from what they had in their youth. For since when men grow old, they lack energy, but increase in judgment and prudence, it is inevitable that what in their youth appeared to be tolerable and good, in their old age should become intolerable and bad, so that instead of blaming the times, they should lay the blame on their own judgment. Furthermore, human appetites are insatiable, for by nature we were so constituted that there is nothing we cannot long for, but by fortune we are such that of these things we can attain but few. The result is that the human mind is perpetually discontented, and of its possessions is apt to grow weary. This makes it find fault with the present, praise the past, and long for the future, though for its doing so no rational cause can be assigned. Hence I am not sure but that I deserve to be reckoned among those who thus deceive themselves, if in these my discourses I have praised too much of the days of the ancient Romans, and have found fault with their own. Indeed, if the virtue which then prevailed and the vices which are prevalent today were not as clear as the sun, I should be much more reserved in my statements, lest I should fall into the very fault for which I am blaming others. But as the facts are there for anyone to see, I shall make so bold as to declare plainly what I think of those days and of our own, so that the minds of young men who read what I have written may turn from the one and prepare to imitate the other, wherever fortune provides them with the occasion for so doing. For it is the duty of a good man to point out to others what is well done, even though the malignity of the times or of fortune has not permitted you to do it for yourself, to the end that, of the many who have the capacity, someone more beloved of heaven may be able to do it. Having therefore the discourses of the last book spoken of the decisions of Rome came to in regard to the internal affairs of the city, in this we shall speak of the measures the Roman people took to increase their empire. Discourses 1 through 5. Methods of expansion. 1. Whether virtue or fortune was the principal cause of the empire which Rome acquired. Many are of the opinion, and among them Plutarch, a writer of great weight, that the Roman people was indebted for the empire it acquired rather to fortune than to virtue. Among other reasons he adduces, he says that the Roman people, by their own confession, admit this, since they ascribed all their victories to fortune, and erected more temples to fortune than to any other god. It would seem that with this view Livy also agrees, for rarely does he put into the mouth of any Roman a speech in which he tells of virtue without conjoining fortune with it. With this view I cannot by any means agree, nor do I think it can be upheld, for if there is nowhere to be found a republic so successful as was Rome, this is because there is nowhere to be found a republic so constituted as to be able to make the conquest Rome made, for it was the virtue of her armies that caused Rome to acquire an empire, and it was her constitutional procedure and the peculiar customs which she owed to her first legislator that enabled her to maintain what she had acquired, as will be explained at length in many of the discourses which follow. The aforesaid writers claim that Rome's never having been engaged in two very big wars at one and the same time was due to the fortune, not to the virtue, of the Roman people. For there was no war with the Latins until Rome had so thoroughly beaten the Samnites that she had to go to war to their defense. Nor did the Romans fight the Tuscans until the Latins had been subjugated, and the Samnites were almost entirely exhausted by frequent defeats. Yet had two of these powers, while yet intact and vigorous, united together, it is easy to conjecture, nor can one doubt, that it would have meant ruin for the Roman Republic. Anyhow, however what came about, it is a fact that the Romans never had two very big wars going on at the same time. On the contrary, one finds that either when one began, the other faded out, or that when one faded out, the other began. This can easily be seen from the order in which their wars took place. For, setting aside those waged before Rome was taken by the Gauls, we see that, while they were fighting with the Aequi and the Volsci, no other people attacked them so long as the Aequi and the Volsci were strong. It was only after they were beaten that the war with the Samnites arose, and although before this the war was over, the Latin peoples rebelled against the Romans, yet when this rebellion occurred, the Samnites were already in alliance with Rome, and with their armies helped the Romans to subjugate the Latin insolence. When they had been subjugated, the war with Samnium flared up again, and when the forces of the Samnites were beaten owing to the many routs inflicted on them, the war with the Tuscans broke out, and when this was settled, the Samnites started a fresh one, owing to the arrival of Pyrrhus in Italy. On Pyrrhus being repulsed and sent back to Greece, they started on their first war with the Carthaginians, and scarce was this war over when all the Gauls, both from this and from the other side of the Alps, conspired against the Romans, with the result that they were defeated with the immense slaughter between Popolonia and Pisa, where the Tower of St. Vincent now stands. When this war ended, they had no war of any importance for the space of 20 years, for they fought with no one except the Ligurians and what remained of the Gauls in Lombardy. Matters stood thus until the Second Punic War, which led to Italy's being occupied for 16 years. When this came to an end amid great glory, the Macedonian War broke out, and when this was over, there came the war with Antiochus and with Asia, after which victories there remained in the whole world neither princes nor republics, which, either alone or altogether, could successfully oppose the forces of Rome. If, before the final victory, we consider well the order in which these wars took place, and the Roman method of procedure, it will be seen that in them, mingled with fortune, was virtue and prudence of a very high order. Hence, if one looks for the cause of this fortune, it should be easy to find, for it is quite certain that when a prince and a people has acquired such repute that each of the neighboring princes and peoples is afraid to attack it and fears it, no one will ever assault it unless driven thereunto by necessity, so that it will be open, so to speak, to that power to choose the neighbor on which it seems best to make war, and industriously to foster tranquillity among the rest. In this, owing in part to the respect they have for its power, and in part to their being deceived by the means it takes to lull them to sleep, they readily acquiesce. For other powers, which are farther away and have no intercourse with it, look on the affair as remote from their interests and has no concern of theirs, and in this error they remain until the conflagration that is at their doors. Nor, when it arrives, have they any means of stopping it, except by their own forces, which will then be inadequate, since the state in question has now become very powerful. I do not propose to deal with the Samnites, who stood by, watching the Roman people overcome the Volsci and the Aequi, and lest I should be too prolix, only the Carthaginians, who were already a great power and in great esteem when the Romans were fighting the Samnites and the Tuscans, for they held the whole of Africa, held Sardinia and Sicily, and had dominion over part of Spain. This, their power, conjoined with the fact that they were remote from the confines of the Roman people, accounts for their never having thought of attacking the Romans, or of helping the Samnites and the Tuscans. On the contrary, they acted as men do when things seem to be moving rapidly in another's favor, namely, came to terms with her and sought her friendship. Nor was the mistake thus made at the outset realized until the Romans had conquered all the peoples that lay between them and the Carthaginians, and they began to contend with each other for the dominion of Sicily and Spain. This same thing happened to the Gauls, to Philip, king of Macedon, and to Antiochus, as happened to the Carthaginians. Whilst Rome was engaged with some other state, each of them thought the other state would beat Rome, and that they had time enough to protect themselves against her either by peaceful or by warlike methods. I am of opinion, therefore, that the fortune which Rome had in these matters, all rulers would have who should emulate Roman methods, and should be imbued with the same virtue. I should point out in this the connection how the Romans behaved on entering foreign provinces, had I not spoken of it at length in my treatise on principalities, for I have there discussed the question fully. Here I shall make but this remark in passing. The Romans always took care to have in new provinces some friend to act as a ladder up which to climb, or a door by which to enter, or as a means whereby to hold it. Thus we see that with the help of the Capuans they got into Samnium, of the Camertini into Tuscany, and of the Mamertini into Sicily, of the Saguntines into Spain, of the Massinissa into Africa, of the Aetolians into Greece, of Eumens and other princes into Asia, of the Massilians and the Aeduid into Gaul. Hence they never lacked supporters of this kind to facilitate their enterprises, alike in acquiring the province and in holding it. Peoples who observe such customs will be found to have less need of fortune than those who do not observe them well. That everyone may the better know how much more virtue helped the Romans to acquire their empire than did fortune, we shall in the next chapter discuss the character of the peoples with whom they had to fight, and show how obstinate they were in defending their liberty. 2. Concerning the kind of people the Romans had to fight, and how obstinately they defended their freedom. Nothing made it harder for the Romans to conquer the peoples of the central and outlying parts of Italy than the love which in those times many peoples had for liberty. So obstinately did they defend it that only by outstanding virtue could they ever have been subjugated. For numerous instances show to what dangers they exposed themselves in order to maintain or recover it, and what vendettas they kept up against those who had taken it away. The study of history reveals, too, the harm that servitude has done to peoples and to cities. There is, indeed, in our own times, only one country which can be said to have it in free cities, whereas in the ancient times quite a number of genuinely free peoples were to be found in all countries. One sees how, in the times of which we are speaking at present, the peoples of Italy, from the Apennines, which now divide Tuscany from Lombardy, right down to its toe, were all of them free. The Tuscans, the Romans, the Samnites were, for instance, and so were many other peoples who dwelt in other parts of Italy. One never hears of there being any kings, apart from those who reigned in Rome, and Porcina, the king of Tuscany, whose stock became extinct. Though history does not tell us how, it is quite clear, however, that at the time when the Romans laid siege to Veii, Tuscany was free. Moreover, it enjoyed its freedom so much, and so hated the title of prince, that when the people of Veii appointed a king in that city for the purpose of defense, and asked the Tuscans to help them against the Romans, the Tuscans, after many consultations had been held, decided not to give help to the people of Veii so long as they lived under a king, since they held that they could not well defend a country whose people had already placed themselves in subjugation to someone else. It is easy to see how this affection of peoples for self-government comes about. For experience shows that cities have never increased, either in dominion or wealth, unless they have been independent. It is truly remarkable to observe the greatness which Athens attained in the space of 100 years after it had been liberated from the tyranny of Pisistratus. But most marvelous of all is it to observe the greatness which Rome attained after freeing itself from its kings. The reason is easy to understand, for it is not the well-being of individuals that makes the city great, but the well-being of the community, and it is beyond question that it is only in republics that the common good is looked to properly in that all that promotes it is carried out. And however much this or that private person may be the loser on this account, there are so many who benefit thereby that the common good can be realized in spite of those few who suffer the consequences. The opposite happens when there is a prince, for what he does in his own interests usually harms the city, and what is done in the interests of the city harms him. Consequently, as soon as tyranny replaces self-government, the least of the evils which this tyranny brings about are that it ceases to make progress and to grow in power and wealth. More often than not, nay, always, what happens is that it declines. And should fate decree the rise of an efficient tyrant, so energetic and so proficient in warfare that he enlarges his dominions, no advantage will accrue to the commonwealth, but only to himself, for he cannot bestow honors on the valiant and good citizens over whom he tyrannizes, since he does not want to have any cause to suspect them. Nor yet can he allow the cities he acquires to make their submission to, or to become the tributaries of, the city of which he is the tyrant. For to make it powerful is not in his interest. It is to his interest to keep the state divided, so that each town and each district may recognize only him as its ruler. In this way he alone profits by his acquisitions, not his country. Should anyone desire to confirm this view by a host of further arguments, let him read Xenophon's treatise on tyrannicide. It is no wonder, then, that the peoples of old detested tyrants and gave them no peace, or that they were so fond of liberty and held the word itself in such esteem, as happened when Hieronymus, the grandson of Hero, the Syracusan, was killed in Syracuse, and the news of his death came to his army, which was not very far from Syracuse. At first there was a tumult, and men took up arms against those who had killed him. But when they perceived that in Syracuse the cry was for liberty, they were so delighted to hear the word that all became quiet, and setting aside their anger against the tyrannicides, they began to consider how self-government should be organized in that city. Nor is it surprising that peoples are so extraordinarily revengeful towards those who have destroyed their liberty. Of this there are numerous examples, but I propose to give but one, which happened in Corcyra, a city of Greece, during the Peloponnesian War. Greece was then divided into two parties, of which one supported the Athenians, the other the Spartans. The result was that in many cities internal dissensions arose, some advocating an alliance with Sparta, others an alliance with Athens. This happened in Corcyra, where the nobles got the upper hand and deprived the populace of its liberty. But with the help of the Athenians, the populace regained their strength, laid hand on all the nobles, and shut them up in one prison which held them all. Then they took them, 8 or 10 at the time, on the plea of banishing them to various parts, and then, to set an example of them, put them to death, with much cruelty. When those who were left heard of this, they considered whether there was any possible way in which they could escape this ignominious death. So, having armed themselves with anything at hand, they defended the entrance to the prison, and fought with those who tried to get in. The result was that, when the rumors of this reached the populace, they came in a crowd, removed the upper story and roof from the building, and smothered the inmates beneath the ruins. Many well-known instances of a like horrible nature happened later in this country. We thus see how true it is that a liberty which you have actually had taken away is avenged with much greater ferocity than is a liberty which someone has only tried to take away. If one asks oneself how it comes about that peoples of old were more fond of liberty than they are today, I think the answer is that it is due to the same cause that makes men today less bold than they used to be, and this is due, I think, to the difference between our education and that of bygone times, which is based on the difference between our religion and the religion of those days. For our religion, having taught us the truth and the true way of life, leads us to ascribe less esteem to worldly honor. Hence the Gentiles, who held it in high esteem, looked upon it as their highest good, displayed in their actions more ferocity than we do. This is evidenced by many of their institutions. To begin with, compare the magnificence of their sacrifices with the humility that characterizes ours. The ceremonial in ours is delicate rather than imposing, and there is no display of ferocity or courage. Their ceremonies lacked neither pomp nor magnificence, but conjoined with this were sacrificial arts in which there was much shedding of blood and much ferocity, and in them great numbers of animals were killed. Such spectacles, because terrible, caused men to become like them. Besides, the old religion did not beautify men unless they were replete with worldly glory, army commanders, for instance, and rulers of the republics. Our religion has glorified humble and contemplative men rather than men of action. It is designed as a man's highest good humility, abnegation, and contempt for mundane things, whereas the other identified it with magnanimity, bodily strength, and everything else that conduces to make men very bold. And if our religion demands that in you there be strength, what it asks for is a strength to suffer rather than a strength to do bold things. This pattern of life, therefore, appears to have made the world weak, and to have handed it over as a prey to the wicked who run it successfully and securely, since they are well aware that the generality of men, with paradise for their goal, consider how best to bear rather than how best to avenge their injuries. But though it looks as if the world were become effeminate, and as if heaven were powerless, this is undoubtedly due rather to the pusillanimity of those who have interpreted our religion in terms of laissez-faire, and not in terms of virtue. For, had they borne in mind that religion permits us to exalt and defend the fatherland, they would have seen that it also wishes us to love and honor it, and to train ourselves to be such that we may defend it. This kind of education, then, and these grave misinterpretations, account for the fact that we see in the world fewer republics than there used to be of old, and that, consequently, in peoples we do not find the same love of liberty as there then was. Yet I can well believe that it was rather the Roman Empire which, with its armed forces and its grandiose ideas, wiped out all republics and all their civic institutions, that was the cause of this, and though, later on, Rome's empire disintegrated, its cities have never been able to pull themselves together, nor to set up again a constitutional regime, save in one or two parts of that empire. Anyhow, however this may be, the Romans encountered in all parts of the world, however small, a combination of well-armed republics, extremely obstinate in the defense of their liberty, which shows that, if the virtue of the Roman people had not been of a rare and very high order, they would never have been able to overcome them. Of instances which bear this out, I shall cite but one case, that of the Samnites. It is a remarkable thing, as Livy admits, that they should have been so powerful and their arms so strong, that they were able to withstand the Romans right up to the time of Papirius Cursor, the consul, the son of the first Papirius, i.e. to withstand them for the space of 46 years, in spite of many disastrous defeats, the destruction of towns, and the slaughter of the inhabitants of their country, a slaughter so great that in this country, in which there were formerly seen so many cities and so many inhabitants, was now almost deserted, whereas at one time it was so well ordered and so strong that it would have been impossible if it had not been confronted with a virtue such as Rome's. It is easy, moreover, to see whence arose that order and how this disorder came about, for it is all due to the independence which was then and to the servitude which now is. Because, as has been said before, all towns and all countries that are in all respects free profit by this enormously. For, wherever increasing populations are found, it is due to the freedom with which marriage is contracted, and to its being more desired by men. And this comes about where every man is ready to have children, since he believes that he can rear them, and feels sure that his patrimony will not be taken away, and since he knows that not only will they be born free instead of into slavery, but that, if they have virtue, they will have a chance of becoming rulers. One observes, too, how riches multiply and abound there, alike those that come from agriculture and those that are produced by trades, for everybody is eager to acquire such things and to obtain property, provided he be convinced that he will enjoy it when it has been acquired. It thus comes about that, in competition with the other, men look both to their own advantage and to that of the republic, so that in both respects wonderful progress is made. The contrary of this happens in countries which live in servitude, and the harder their servitude, the more does the well-being to which they are accustomed dwindle. Of all forms of servitude, too, that is the hardest which subjects you to a republic. For, first, because it is more lasting, and because there is no hope of escape. Secondly, because the aim of a republic is to derive all their corporations of their vitality and to weaken them, to the end that its own body corporate may increase. A prince who makes you his subject does not do this unless he be a barbarian who devastates the country and destroys all that man has done for that civilization, as Oriental princes do. On the contrary, if his institutions be humane and he behave constitutionally, he will more often than not be equally fond of all the cities that are subject to him, and will leave them in possession of all their trades and all their ancient institutions, so that, if they are unable to increase, as free cities do, they will not be ruined like those that are enslaved. I refer here to the servitude that befalls cities which are subject to a foreigner, for of those that are subject to one of their own, citizens have already spoken. He who reflects, therefore, on all that has been said, will not wonder at the power the Samnites had when free, or at the weakness that befell them later, when they became a subject state. This Titus Livy attests in several places, particularly in his account of the war with Hannibal, where he shows how the Samnites, when they had been maltreated by a legion that lay at Nola, sent messengers to Hannibal to ask him to come to their aid. In their address, they told him that for 100 years they had been fighting the Romans with their own troops and their own armies, and that often they had held up 2 consular armies and 2 consuls, but that now they had come to such a pass that they could scarce hold their own against a small Roman legion which that was at Nola. 3. Rome became a great city by ruining the cities round about her, and by granting foreigners easy access to her honors. Rome meanwhile grows on the ruins of Alba. Those who plan to convert a city into a great empire should use every available device to fill it with inhabitants, for unless a city has a large male population, it cannot do much. These are 2 ways of acquiring a large population, by friendliness and by force. It is done by friendliness when the road is kept open and safe for foreigners who propose to come and dwell there, so that everybody is glad to do so. It is done by force when neighboring cities are destroyed and their inhabitants are set to dwell in your city. This custom was so studiously observed in Rome that, in the time of its 6th king, there dwelt in Rome 80,000 men bearing arms. For in this the Romans sought to do as the good farmer does, who, that a plant may grow big and produce and mature its fruits, cuts off the first branches that are put forth, so that its roots may gather virtue, and in due course may produce greener and more fruitful branches. That this method of providing for expansion in a future empire was both necessary and good is shown by the example of Sparta and Athens, 2 republics which were very well armed and governed by the best laws, yet never attained the greatness of the Roman Empire, though Rome appears to have been more tumultuous and not so well governed as they were. For this no reason can be assigned other than that already adduced. For Rome, by pursuing these 2 ways of enlarging the composition of her city, was able to put under arms 280,000 men, whereas Sparta and Athens could never muster 20,000 each. This was not due to Rome's being in a more advantageous position than was theirs, but simply to the difference in their modes of procedure. For Lycurgus, the founder of the Spartan Republic, thought nothing more likely to frustrate his laws than the admixture of new inhabitants, and so did everything he could to prevent foreigners having any intercourse with the citizens. Not only was intermarriage forbidden, but also the admittance to civic rights and other forms of intercommunication which bring men together. In addition to which, he instituted a coinage of leather, so that nobody might be tempted to come there with merchandise or any manufactured goods. Hence it was impossible for the inhabitants of that city ever to grow in number. Since all our actions resemble those of nature, it is neither possible nor natural that a slender trunk should support a heavy branch. Hence a small republic cannot take possession of cities and kingdoms which are stronger and larger than itself, and should it actually do so, it will happen as it does in the case of a tree which has a branch that is bigger than its trunk. It will support the branch with difficulty, and the least wind weakens it. This is just what happened to Sparta. It occupied all the cities of Greece. Then, when Thebes rebelled, all the other cities rebelled, and the trunk was left without branches. In Rome's case, this could not happen, for it had so large a trunk that it could easily support any branch. This mode of procedure, therefore, together with others of which we shall presently speak, made Rome great and exceedingly powerful, as Titus Livy pithily points out when he says, Rome meanwhile grows on the ruins of Alba. 4. Republics have adopted 3 methods of expansion. The student of ancient histories will find that there are 3 ways in which republics have expanded. The first was that which the Tuscans of old adopted, namely that of forming a league consisting of several republics in which no one of them had preference, authority, or rank above the others, and in which, when other cities were acquired, they made them constitute members in the same way as the Swiss act in our times, and as in Greece the Achaeans and the Aetolians acted in olden times. Now, since the Romans made frequent war on the Tuscans, I shall pay attention to them in order the better to show the nature of this first method. Before the Romans established their imperium in Italy, the Tuscans were very powerful, both by sea and by land. Though of their affairs history gives no exact account, there are 1 or 2 records and monuments which give some indication of their greatness. We know, for instance, that they sent to the Mare Serpurum, a colony which they called Adria, and that it was of such noble proportions that it gave its name to that sea, which is still called the Adriatic by the Latins. We likewise know that their arms held sway from the Tiber right up to the foot of the Alps, which encircle there the main portion of Italy, though they lost their imperium over that country, which is now called Lombardy, 200 years before the Romans acquired much power. For this district was occupied by the Gauls, who, driven by necessity, or attracted by the sweetness of its fruit, and especially of its wine, invaded Italy under Bellovesus, their leader, defeated and drove out the inhabitants, and settled in this region, where they built many towns. They called this district a Gaul, since this was the name they then bore, and they held it till they were conquered by the Romans. The Tuscans, therefore, worked on the basis of equality, and in expanding, followed the first of the methods mentioned above. There were 12 cities, and among others they included Chiusi, Veii, Arezzo, Fiesole, Volterra, and so forth, each of which, as a member of the League, shared in the government of its empire. They never succeeded, however, in extending their gains beyond Italy, and of Italy, too, the greater part remained intact, for reasons which will presently be given. The second method consists in forming alliances in which you reserve to yourself the headship, the seat in which the central authority resides, and the right of initiative. This was the method adopted by the Romans. The third method is to make other states subjects instead of allies, as the Spartans and the Athenians did. Of these three methods, the last is quite useless, as is seen in the case of the two republics just mentioned, for they came to disaster for the simple reasons that they had acquired a dominion which they could not hold. For to undertake the responsibility of governing cities by force, especially such as have been accustomed to self-government, is a difficult and tiresome business. And unless you have armed forces, and they are strong forces, you can neither impose ingredients on nor rule them. For, if this be your plan, it is essential to have allies to assist you, and to increase the population of your own city. Wherefore, since these two cities did neither of these things, their mode of procedure was futile. But since Rome, which exemplifies the second method, did both, she rose to exceedingly great power. And since she was the only state that thus behaved, she was the only one that became so powerful. And since she made many states her allies throughout the whole of Italy, which to a large extent lived under the same laws, and since, on the other hand, she reserved to herself, as has been said, the seat of empire, and had the right to issue orders, these allies, without being aware of it, fell under her yoke, and labored and shed their blood on her behalf. For when they began to go forth with the armies of Italy, and to transform kingdoms into provinces, and to make subjects of those who did not mind being subjects, since they were accustomed to live under kings, and who, since they had Roman governors, and had been conquered by armies bearing the Roman insignia, recognized no superior other than Rome, the result was that Rome's allies inside Italy found themselves before long encircled by Roman subjects, with an immense city, such as Rome had now become, towering above them, so that, when they realized their mistake they had been making, it was too late to put it to right, and so great was the authority of Rome now exercised over outside provinces, and so great the force which lay at her disposal within, since she had a city so enormous and so extremely well armed. And though her allies, to avenge their injuries, formed a league against her, they were soon defeated in war, with the result that their position became worse. For instead of being Rome's allies, they now became Rome's subjects. This mode of procedure, as has been said, has only been adopted by the Romans, nor can a republic that wants to expand adopt any other, for experience has shown that no other is so certain or so sure. The alternative method of leagues, mentioned above and adopted by the Tuscans, the Achaeans, and the Aetolians, and today by the Swiss, is the next best to that of the Romans, for though by this method it is impossible to expand indefinitely, it has two advantages. First, it does not readily involve you in war. Secondly, you can easily hold as much as you take. The reason why such a republic cannot expand is that its members are distinct, and each has its own capital, which makes it difficult for them to consult and to make decisions. It also means that they are less keen on acquiring dominion, for, since many communities share in that dominion, they do not appreciate further acquisitions in the same way as does a single republic which hopes to enjoy the whole. Furthermore, a league is governed by a council, which must needs be slower in arriving at any decision than are those who dwell within one and the same circle. Experience shows, too, that such a method of forming a confederation has a fixed limit, and that there is no case which indicates that this limit can be transcended. 12 or 14 communities join together, and beyond that they do not seek to go, for having attained the stage at which it seems to them they can defend themselves against all comers, they do not try to extend their dominion, whether because necessity does not require them to have more power, or because they see no advantage in acquisitions for the reasons already given. For in that case, they would have to do one of two things, either to proceed to get allies, which owing to their number would entail confusion, or to make others their subjects, which they do not care to do, since in that they see difficulty and in having them no great advantage. Hence, when they have reached the number which appears to promise security, they devote themselves to two things. 1. They accept and undertake the protection of those who apply for it, and by this means get from all around money which can easily be distributed among them. 2. They also fight for others, and take pay from a prince here and a prince there who is prepared to spend money on his enterprises. This, as we see, is what the Swiss are doing today. It is also, as we read, what was done by the states mentioned above. Titus Livy bears witness to this when he tells us that, at a conference between Philip, king of Macedonia, and Titus Quintus Flaminius, they were talking together amicably in the presence of a praetor from the Aetolians, and that when this praetor came to speak with Philip, Philip upbraided him for the advice and double dealing of his people, alleging that the Aetolians had not been ashamed to fight on one side and then to let their men take service with its enemy, so that the insignia of the Aetolians were often seen in two armies which were opposed. We find, then, that this method of forming leagues has always been the same, and has led to the same results. We see, too, that this method of acquiring subjects has always entailed weakness and has produced but small advantages, and that those who went beyond the appropriate limit were speedily ruined. Moreover, if this method of acquiring subjects is useless to republics that are armed, it is utterly useless to those that are without arms, as has proved to be the case of the Italian republics in our times. It thus becomes clear that the proper method to adopt is that which the Romans adopted, which is so much the more remarkable in that it was never adopted before and has never been imitated by anyone since Rome. As to leagues, they are only found among the Swiss and in the Swabian League, which has copied it. And, as we said at the close of this topic, a great many institutions observed in Rome, pertaining both to internal and foreign affairs, are not only not imitated at the present time, but are deemed to be of no account, since some are looked on as fables, others as impractical, others as irrelevant and useless, with the result that, owing to this ignorance, we, in Italy, have become the prey of anybody who has wanted to overrun this land. Yet, if to imitate the Roman way seems to be difficult, that of the Tuscans of old should not appear so difficult, especially to the Tuscans of today. For though they were unable, for the reasons assigned, to form an empire like that of Rome, they did succeed in acquiring in Italy such power as this method of proceeding allowed. This method, too, was for a long time secure, resulting in the greatest glories of empire and arms in the highest degree, as well as customs and religious observances which are worthy of the highest praise. It was by the Gauls that this power and glory was first reduced, and by the Romans that it was extinguished. And so completely was it extinguished that great as was the power of the Tuscans 2,000 years ago, of it at the present there scarce remains a trace, which leads me to consider how things come to be thus lost in oblivion, a point that will be discussed in the next chapter. 5. Changes of religion and of language, together with such misfortunes as floods or pestilence, obliterate the records of the past. To those philosophers who want to make out that the world is eternal, I think the answer might be that, if it really were as old as all this, it would be reasonable to expect there would be records going back further than 5,000 years. Did we not see how the records of times gone by are obliterated by diverse causes, of which some are due to men and some to heaven? Those which are due to men are changes in religious institutions and in language, for when a new religious institution comes to being, i.e. a new religion, its first care is, for the sake of its own reputation, to wipe out the old one, and when the founders of a new religion happen to speak a different tongue, the old one is easily abolished. This becomes clear if we consider the measures which Christianity adopted vis-a-vis paganism, how it abolished all pagan institutions, all pagan rites, and destroyed the records of the theology of the ancients. It is true that Christianity did not succeed in wiping out altogether the record of what outstanding men of the old religion had done, which was due to the retention of the Latin language. For this they had to retain so that they might be able to use it in writing down their new laws. Had they been able to write them in a new tongue, there would, if we bear in mind the way they persecuted in other matters, there have been no record of the past left at all. Whoever reads of these measures taken by St. Gregory and other heads of the Christian religion, we will see what a fuss they made about getting rid of all records of the past, how they burnt the works of poets and historians, destroyed images, and spoiled everything else that betokened in any way antiquity, so much so that, if to this persecution there had been conjoined a new language, in a short time one would have found all traces of the past wiped out. One can well believe, therefore, that what Christianity did with regard to paganism, paganism did to the religion that preceded it, and as there have been 2 or 3 changes of religion in 5 or 6,000 years, the record of what happened before that has been lost, or if of it there remains a trace, it is regarded as a fable, and no credence is given to it, as has happened with regard to the history of Diodorus Siculus, which covers a period of some 40 or 50,000 years, but is looked upon as untrustworthy, as I believe it to be. The causes due to heaven are those which wipe out a whole generation and reduce the inhabitants in certain parts of the world to but a few. This is brought about by pestilence, or by famine, or by a flood, and of these the most important is the last, alike because it is more widespread, and because those who survive are all of them rude mountain dwellers, who have no knowledge of antiquity, and so cannot hand it down to posterity. And should there be among the survivors anyone who has such knowledge, he will conceal it or distort it in his own fashion, so as to establish his own reputation and that of his family, with the result that there will remain to his successors just so much as he has chosen to record, and nothing more. That these floods, pestilences, and famines happen, I do not think anyone can doubt, for plenty of them are recorded everywhere in history. Their effect in obliterating the past is plain to see, and it seems reasonable that it should be so, for as in the case of simple bodies, when nature has accumulated too much superfluous material, it frequently acts in the same way, and by means of a purge restores health to the body. Similarly, in the case of that body which comprises a mixture of human races, when every province is replete with the inhabitants who can neither obtain a livelihood nor move elsewhere, since all their places are occupied and full up, and when the craftiness and malignity of man has gone as far as it can go, the world must needs be purged in one of these three ways, so that mankind, being reduced to comparatively few and humbled by adversity, may adopt a more appropriate form of life and grow better. There was, then, as we have said before, a time when Tuscany was a powerful country, full of religion and of virtue, with its own customs and its own language, all of which we know was wiped out by the power of Rome, so that of it, as has been said, there remains not but the remembrance of its name. Discourses 6 through 10. Colonization and war, its causes and cost. 6. How the Romans proceeded in the waging of war. Having discussed the procedure which the Romans adopted in expanding their dominions, I shall now discuss the procedure they adopted in conducting a war. As in all their actions, it will be seen here how wise they were to depart from the generally expected methods in order to pave the way to the greatness of the highest order. The aim of those who make war by choice or from ambition is to get something, and to keep what they acquire, and in this to proceed in such a way that the country which is their fatherland is thereby not impoverished but enriched. It is necessary, therefore, alike in acquiring and in keeping, to avoid expense, and instead to do everything so that the public may profit thereby. In view of all this, it is expedient to keep to the Roman way of proceeding, which in the first was, as the French would say, to make wars short and crushing. For since the Romans put large armies on the field, the wars they waged with the Latins, the Samnites, and the Tuscans were all over in a very short time. If one consults the records, indeed, it will be found that all their expeditions, from the start up to the siege of Veii, took, but in some cases 6, in some 10, and in others 20 days. For their practice was, as soon as a war had been declared, to lead forth their armies against the enemy, and at once engage him in battle. When they had won, the enemy, to prevent them devastating the surrounding country, came to terms, and the Romans confiscated some of his lands, which they handed over either for private use or to a colony which they placed on the enemy's frontiers for the protection of Rome's boundaries, with advantage both to the colonists who had the land and to the Roman public, who had a garrison there at no expense to themselves. Nor than this way of proceeding could have been any safer, more forceful, more useful. For, so long as the enemy was not in the field, this garrison sufficed. While, should they go forth in strength to attack the colony, once again the Romans marched out in strength and gave them battle. And when the battle had been fought and won, and they had imposed yet heavier conditions, they went back home. They thus came, step by step, to acquire a reputation greater than the enemy's, and to increase their own strength at home. They kept strictly to this method of making war till after the siege of Veii, when they made a change in their procedure. That they might carry on a longer war, they decided to pay their soldiers, which at first had been unnecessary, since the wars were short, so they were not then paid. But, though the idea of the Romans in paying their troops was that it would enable them to make longer wars, and to meet the case of more distant wars which would keep the troops longer in the field, yet they never departed from their basic principle of getting wars over quickly as far as place and time allowed, nor did they ever depart from the custom of sending out colonies. For in regard to the first method, namely that of making wars short, apart from this having become their natural practice, the ambitions of the consuls kept them to it, since they held office only for a year, of this year spent 6 months at home, and were keen on ending the war in order to have a triumph. They continued to plant colonies because of their usefulness and of the great opportunities they presented. They did indeed change somewhat the arrangement in regard to booty, and in this were not so generous as they had been at first, for, it did not seem to them necessary now that the troops were paid, and since the booty was now greater, they thought it a good plan that the public should benefit by it, so that they would not have to tax the city to pay for their enterprises. In a very short time, this practice made the treasury very rich. These two methods, then, of distributing the spoils and of sending out colonies, caused Rome to become enriched by her wars, whereas other princes and republics, being less wise, are impoverished by them. Indeed, it went so far that in the end a consul does not seem to have been able to obtain a triumph unless he brought plenty of silver and gold and other booty of all sorts for the treasury's benefit. Thus the Romans, by the aforesaid methods, and by getting over their wars quickly, being able in the long run to tire out their enemies alike by defeating them, raiding them, and by means of treaties advantageous to themselves, became ever richer and more powerful. 7. How much land the Romans gave to their colonists. I find it difficult to discover the truth about how much land the Romans distributed when they started a colony, for it depended more or less, I think, on the place to which the colonies were sent. It would seem, however, that in all cases and in all places no colonist got more than a small share. This was done, first, that more men might be sent out as garrison to defend some district, and secondly, because it was unreasonable that, whereas at home people lived as poor men, they should want their colonists to have a superfluity. The Titus Livy tells us how, when Veii was taken, they sent out a colony, and to each colonist granted 3 jugera and 7 usia of land. For this they had a further reason. It was not, they held, having plenty of land, but its good cultivation that would tell. But all colonies, of course, necessarily also had public land on which anyone's cattle might graze, and where wood might be gathered for fires, without which no colony can support itself. 8. The causes which lead peoples to quit their own country and to inundate the lands of others. Since we have just been discussing the procedure adopted by the Romans in their wars, and how the Tuscans were attacked by the Gauls, it will not be irrelevant here, I think, to point out that there are 2 ways in which wars come about. Sometimes they are due to the ambition of princes or of republics which are seeking to set up an empire, under which head falls wars waged by Alexander the Great and those waged by the Romans, those which are continually being waged between this power and that. Such wars are dangerous, but they do not entirely remove the inhabitants of the country invaded, for the victor is content provided its people become subject to its obedience, often lets them keep their own laws, and always leaves them their houses and their chattels. The other way in which war is brought about is when a whole people and all its families leave a place, driven thence either by famine or by war, and sets out to look for a new home and a new country in which to live. In this case it takes not, as in the previous case, merely govern there, but it takes possession of every single thing, and expels or kills the old inhabitants. This war of the most cruel and terrifying kind. It is to such wars that Sallust refers when, towards the end of his Jugurtha, he says that after Jugurtha's defeat, the progress of the Gallic invasion of Italy began to be felt, and of this invasion says also that whereas the Roman people fought with all other peoples merely for supremacy, with the Gauls the fight was always as to which of them should survive. For to a prince or to a republic that invades a foreign province, it suffices if he get rid of those who rule there, but to a whole peoples it is essential to get rid of all the inhabitants, since they want to live on that on which the others used to live. The Romans sustained 3 of these extremely dangerous wars. During the first, Rome was captured and occupied by those Gauls who, as we said, had taken Lombardy from the Tuscans and established themselves there. For this war, Livy assigns 2 causes. First, as we said, they were attracted by the delicious Italian fruit and wines which in Gaul were not to be had. Secondly, the population of the kingdom of Gaul had multiplied to such an extent that they could no longer find enough fruit there, so the princes in those parts deemed it necessary that some of them should go in search of new lands, and after discussing the matter, chose as the commanders of those who were to depart, Bellovesus and Sigoversus, 2 Gallic kings, of whom the first went to Italy and the second crossed into Spain. The result of Bellovesus going into Italy was the occupation of Lombardy, and from this arose the first war which the Gauls made on Rome. The second was that which occurred after the first Punic War, when between Piombino and Pisa the Romans killed more than 200,000 Gauls. The third was that in which the Germans and the Cimbri invaded Italy, where, after defeating several Roman armies, they were beaten by Marius. The Romans then won these 3 highly hazardous wars, and to win them called for more than a modicum of virtue. For we see how, when later on, the virtue of Rome declined and its armies lost their former virtue, their empire was destroyed by peoples of the same type, namely, by Goths, Vandals, and such like people, who occupied the whole of the Western Empire. People such as these quit their own lands when constrained to do so by necessity, as has been said above, and the necessity is due either to famine or to a war or to hardship undergone in their own country. For in such a case they are constrained to go in search of new lands, and such peoples, when they are very numerous, then make a violent incursion into the lands of others, kill the inhabitants, seize their goods, and establish a new kingdom under a new name. This was done by Moses and by the peoples who overran the Roman Empire. For new names are now used in Italy and other provinces are due simply to their having been so called by their new conquerors. Thus Lombardy used to be called Cisalpine Gaul, France used to be called Transalpine Gaul, but got to its present name from the Franks, who gave it this name when they occupied it. Slavonia used to be called Illyria, Hungary, Pannonia, England, Britannia, and of so many other provinces which changed names, which would be tedious to recount. So, too, Moses gave the name Judea to that part of Syria which he occupied. Since I said above that such peoples are sometimes forced to go and look for new lands because they are driven from those they inhabit by war, I propose in an instance of this to cite the Moors, peoples that originally dwelt in Syria. When these peoples heard that the Hebrews were coming, they thought resistance impossible, so decided that it would be better to leave their country and save themselves rather than lose themselves in an attempt to save their country. So with their families deserted, they went to Africa, where they established themselves after expelling the inhabitants whom they found in those parts. Thus, a people which could not defend its own country succeeded in taking somebody else's. Procopius, who writes of the war Belisarius waged with the Vandals, who occupied Africa, tells us he came across inscriptions on certain columns in places where the Moors used to live, which said, "We are the Moors who fled before the face of Joshua, the robber, the son of Nun." This makes it clear why the Moors left Syria. Peoples, therefore, who have been driven out by sheer necessity are very formidable, and unless confronted by good armies, can never be held back. But when those are constrained to abandon their country are not numerous, they are not so dangerous as the peoples we have been discussing, for they have not the same force at their disposal, but must resort to artifice in order to get territory, and, having obtained it, must make alliances and form confederations in order to hold it, as we see that Aeneas, Dido, the Massilians, and such like did, all of whom maintained their footing in the place where they had settled by the consent of their neighbors. The larger migrations, involving whole peoples, have come from Scythia, a country that is cold and poor. In it, when the population becomes large, the land is not fertile enough to sustain it, and they are forced to emigrate. For there are many causes to drive them out, and none to keep them home. And if for the last 500 years there have been no inundations of these people, there are several causes that account for this. First, there was the great evacuation, which occurred in that country during the decline of the empire, when more than 30 peoples emerged. Secondly, Germany and Hungary, from which emigrations of these peoples also took place, are now prosperous lands where peoples can live in comfort, so that there is no need to change their habitation. On the contrary, since these peoples are extremely warlike, they form a bastion which prevents the Scythians who live on their borders from attempting either to conquer them or to pass through them. There have also frequently been great movements among the Tartars, which the Hungarians and the people of Poland have withstood, and it has often been their boast that, if it had not been for them, Italy and the Church would on many occasions have felt the weight of Tartar armies. But of these people, I think I have now said enough. 9. What causes commonly give rise to wars between different powers? The cause of the war between the Romans and the Samnites, with whom for a long time they had been in alliance, is one which arises commonly between powerful states. It consists in some incident which is brought about either by chance or by those who are desirous of provoking a war. That which gave rise to war between the Romans and the Samnites was due to chance. For when the Samnites made war on the Sicilians and then on the Campanians, they had no intention of making war on Rome. But when the Campanians were attacked and appealed to Rome, which neither the Romans nor the Samnites had expected, the Romans, to whose suzerainty the Campanians had submitted, had to defend them, and so to take on a war which it did not seem to them that they could with honor escape. For, though it did not appear reasonable that they should defend their allies, the Campanians, against their allies, the Samnites, yet when the former had become their subjects and had accepted their suzerainty, it seemed to them shameful to not defend them, for they thought that, if they did not undertake to defend them, it would put an obstacle in the way of any others who contemplated submitting to their dominion. Since, therefore, Rome was aiming at empire and glory, not at tranquillity, they could not decline to take the matter up. The same causes were operative at the beginning of the First Punic War, which was due to the Romans having undertaken the defense of the Messenians in Sicily, an undertaking which again was brought about by chance. This was not in the case in the Second War, which arose between them, for Hannibal, the Carthaginian commander, attacked the Saguntines, who were allies of the Romans in Spain, not out of hostility toward them, but to get the Roman armies to take action, so as to provide him with the opportunity of attacking them and of crossing into Italy. This method of starting new wars has always been the practice with powerful states who have a certain respect both for treaties and for one another. For if I want to make war on some prince, and between us there is a treaty, the articles of which have been observed for a considerable time, rather than attack him, I shall look for some justification and grounds for attacking one of his allies, knowing full well that, if his ally be attacked, either he will resent it, and I shall get what I want, and that war will arise, or, if he takes no notice, he will disclose either his weakness or his unreliability, in that he does not defend a dependent state. In either case, he will lose his reputation, and it will be easier for me to accomplish my designs. With regard, then, to the provoking of a war, due note should be taken of what has just been said about the submission of the Campanians. It should be noted, too, that a city which does not suffice for its own defense has a remedy, should it desire at all costs to defend itself against attack. The remedy consists in submitting voluntarily to the state whose protection you propose to invoke. Thus the Capuans submitted to the Romans, and the Florentines to King Robert of Naples, who, though not prepared to defend them on the basis of an alliance, when they became his subjects, defended them against all forces which Castruccio da Luca was employing against them. 10. Money is not the sinews of war, as it is commonly supposed to be. Since it is open to anyone having the requisite authority to begin a war but not to end it, a ruler, before committing himself to such an undertaking, should calculate what forces he has at his disposal and act accordingly. Moreover, he should also take good care not to make any mistake about such forces, as he will do every time he bases his calculations on money, or on the terrain, or on the goodwill of men, but on the other hand lacks troops of his own. For though such things undoubtedly add to your strength, they certainly do not provide you with it, and as such are not and of no avail without faithful troops. For without these no amount of money will suffice you. The natural strength of the country will not help you, nor will the goodwill of men last, since they cannot remain faithful to you unless you are able to protect them. Every mountain, every lake, every inaccessible fastness becomes but as a plain when strong defenders are lacking. Money, too, not only affords you no protection, but makes you the sooner fall a prey. Nor can any opinion be more false than that which asserts that money is the sinews of war. This view was advocated by Quintius Curtius in connection with the war which took place between Antipater the Macedonian and King of Sparta, where he tells how, for want of money, the King of Sparta of necessity had to join battle, and was beaten, whereas had he postponed the battle for a few days, he would have had news from Greece of the death of Alexander, and so would have remained the victor without putting up a fight. But since he was without funds, and feared lest for the lack of him his army might desert, he was forced to try his luck in battle. On which ground Quintius Curtius maintains that money is the sinews of war. The view adopted by Quintius Curtius is put forward daily, and is followed by rulers whose prudence is not up to their mark. Taking this as their basic principle, they think that they can defend themselves if they had a well-filled treasury, and do not consider that, if treasuries guaranteed victory, Darius would have conquered Alexander, the Greeks would have conquered the Romans, in our day Duke Charles would have conquered the Swiss, nor yet, but a few days ago, would the combined forces of the Pope and of the Florentines have had any difficulty in overcoming Francesco Maria, the nephew of Julius II, in the War of Urbino. Yet all those mentioned were overcome by those who held the sinews of war lay not in money, but in good soldiers. Among the other things that Croesus, king of Lydia, showed to Solon, the Athenian, was a treasure too great to count. Solon was then asked what opinion he had formed of the king's power, to which he replied that he did not think him more powerful on this account, for war is made with steel, not with gold, and if anyone came along who had more steel than he had, he could deprive him of his power. Again, when, after the death of Alexander the Great, a host of Gauls crossed into Greece, and then to Asia, and sent ambassadors to arrange a treaty with the king of Macedonia, the king, in order to display his power and to frighten them, showed them a lot of gold and silver, whereupon the Gauls, who up until then had been intent on peace, broke off negotiations, so eager were they to relieve him of that gold, so the king was despoiled on account of the very thing he had accumulated for his defense. The Venetians, a few years ago, also had a well-filled treasury, yet lost all on their dominions without being able to use the treasures to defend them. I assert, then, that it is not gold, as is acclaimed by common opinion, that constitutes the sinews of war, but good soldiers, for gold does not find good soldiers, but good soldiers are quite capable of finding gold. If the Romans had chosen to wage war rather by means of money than by the sword, not all the treasures in the world would have sufficed in view of the great enterprises they undertook and the difficulties they had to encounter them. But since they made war with the sword, they did not suffer for want of gold, because those who were afraid of them brought it right to their camps, and if that Spartan king, for lack of money, had to try his luck in battle, that happened to him on the score of money has very often happened for other reasons. For it is obvious that when an army is short of provisions and must needs either die of hunger or fight, it always chooses to fight, since this is the more honorable course, and one that gives fortune some chance to show you favor. Again, it often happens that when a general sees that the enemy's army is about to be reinforced, he must either engage it and try his fortune in battle, or wait till the enemy's forces has increased, and then have to fight anyhow to his own great disadvantage. One sees, too, as happened to Hasdrubal when he was attacked jointly by Claudius, Nero, and the other Roman consul in March, of Ancona, how a general who is obliged either to run away or to fight always chooses to fight, since it seems to him that this course, even though should the issue be extremely doubtful, gives him a chance to win, whereas the other would mean losing in any case. There are, then, many situations which compel a general to prefer the alternative of fighting, even though he had no intention of doing so, of which lack of money may sometimes be one, but one ought not for this reason to infer that money is the sinews of war, any more than are other situations which place men in a like predicament. I repeat, therefore, gold is not the sinews of war, but good soldiers are. Gold is a necessity, but is of secondary importance, and good soldiers can get it for themselves. For it is as impossible for good soldiers to fail to find gold, as it is for gold to find good soldiers. That in this we are speaking the truth, history shows again and again, in spite of the fact that Pericles advised the Athenians to wage war with the whole of the Peloponnese on the ground that their industry and their pecuniary resources should enable them to win it. And though during the war the Athenians sometimes prospered, in the end they lost, so that Sparta's wisdom and good soldiery was worth more than Athens' industry and money. On this point, Titus Livy is a better witness than anybody else. I refer to the passage in which he discusses whether, if Alexander the Great had come to Italy, he would have beaten the Romans. In it, he points out that 3 things are necessary for war: plenty of good soldiers, wise generals, and good luck. And then, having inquired whether the Romans or Alexander was the better off in these things, he draws this conclusion without any mention of money. The Capuans, when they were asked by the Sicilians to take up arms against them, Samnites, must have calculated their strength on a monetary basis, and not on the basis of troops. For when they decided to help them, after being twice routed, they were forced to become Rome's tributaries if they wished to survive. Discourses 11 through 15. Diplomacy and War. 11. It is not a wise course to make an alliance with a ruler whose reputation is greater than his strength. The mistake the Sidicines made in trusting the companions for help, and the mistake the companions made in thinking they could defend them, could not be shown more vividly than it is by Titus Livy when he writes, "The companions brought a name to the help of the Sidicines instead of forces to protect them." It should be noted here that leagues made with rulers who lack either the means to help because they are too far away, or the power to help because they are disorganized, or for other reasons, bring rather repute to the assistance to those who trust in them. It happened thus in our day to the Florentines, when in 1479 the Pope and the King of Naples attacked them. They were allies of the King of France, but from this alliance gained rather a name than protection. The same thing would happen to the ruler who should enter on some enterprise relying on the Emperor Maximilian, for it would be one of those alliances that bring rather a name than protection, which is what Livy says the Capuans brought to the Sidicines. The Capuans, therefore, erred here in thinking their strength greater than it was. So small is the prudence of men that they sometimes undertake to defend others when they neither know how nor are able to defend themselves. Thus, when the Roman army had taken the field against the Samnite army, the Tarentines sent ambassadors to the Roman council to inform him that they wished there to be peace between these two peoples, and that they proposed to make war on whoever should disturb that peace. At this the consul laughed, and in the presence of the ambassadors had the trumpet sounded for battle. He then told his army to go for the enemy, thereby showing, by actions, not by words, what answer he thought they deserved. Having in this chapter discussed the means rulers take, to their own hurt, for the defense of others, in the next I propose to discuss the means they take to defend themselves. 12. Whether it is better, when threatened with attack, to assume the offensive, or to await the outbreak of war. I have sometimes heard men with considerable experience in matters connected with war, discussing whether, if of 2 rulers of approximately equal strength, the more aggressive has declared war on the other, it is the better course for that other to await the enemy within his own boundaries, or to assume the offensive and attack him in his own country. And for each course I have heard arguments adduced. Those who maintain that he should assume the offensive cite the advice Croesus gave to Cyrus when he reached the borders of the Macedonians' territory to make war on them, and Tomyris, their queen, sent him word that it was up to him to choose between 2 courses, either to enter her kingdom, where she was awaiting him, or to let her come and seek him out. When the matter came up for discussion, Croesus, contrary to the views expressed by others, advised him to go and seek her out, on the ground that, if he defeated her when she was outside her own kingdom, he would not deprive her of it, for she would have time to reform her forces, but that if he defeated her on her own territory, he should be able to pursue her when she fled, and since this would give her no chance to reform, he would deprive her of her state. They allege, too, the advice which Hannibal gave to Antiochus when this monarch was contemplating war with the Romans. The Romans, he argued, could only be beaten in Italy, for others might there be able to avail themselves of our arms, their riches, and their allies, whereas anyone who fought with them outside of Italy and left Italy unmolested would leave them with that inexhaustible source whence to draw forces as need arose. He ended by saying that Antiochus had better first try to take Rome before attacking the empire, and Italy before attacking other provinces. They also point out that when Agathocles was unable to cope with war at home, he took the offensive against the Carthaginians who were making war on him, and forced them to sue for peace. They pointed out, too, that Scipio took the offensive in Africa in order to stop the war in Italy. Those who take the opposite view say that if one wants an enemy to succeed ill, one should get him away from his home. They cite the Athenians, who kept the upper hand so long as they were waging war conveniently at home, but who, when they left it took their armies to Sicily, lost their freedom. They also appeal to poetical fables, which tell how Antaeus, king of Libya, was attacked by Hercules Ergidius, was insuperable as long as he awaited him within the confines of his own kingdom, but how, when induced by the craft of Hercules to leave it, he lost both his throne and his life. This gave rise to the fable depicting Antaeus on the ground, drawing strength from his mother, the earth, and Hercules, on seeing this, lifting him up and holding him away from the earth. They also cite modern opinions. Everybody knows that Ferdinand, king of Naples, was in his time to be a very wise prince, and that 2 years before his death it was rumored that Charles VIII, king of France, intended to come and attack him, for which Ferdinand made due preparations, but then fell ill. When about to die, he left to his son, Alfonso, among other memoranda, one telling him to await the enemy within his own domains, and to let nothing on earth persuade him to lead his forces outside the state, but to keep well within his own borders awaiting invasion, with all his forces intact. Of this advice he took no notice, but sent an army into the Romagna, where without fighting a battle he lost both his army and his throne. Besides the reasons adduced above, others are adduced by either side, such as he who takes the offensive shows more spirit than he who waits an attack, and so inspires his army with more confidence, and in addition to this, deprives the enemy of the power to utilize his own resources, since he cannot avail himself of those subjects who have been despoiled. Also owing to his having the enemy within his own domain, the ruler has to be more careful about imposing taxes and other intolerable burdens on his subjects, so that, in the end, as Hannibal said, the fount from which he can draw supplies for the war will run dry. Moreover, the invaders' troops being in a foreign country, there would be all the more necessity for them to fight, and necessity engenders virtue, as we have often remarked. On behalf of the other view, it is said that to await the enemy's attack has many advantages, for, without any disadvantage to yourself, you can impose on him many disadvantages in the matter of provisions and of anything else of which an army has need. You can also the better thwart his plans, owing to your having a better knowledge of the country than he has, and again you can oppose him with stronger forces, owing to the ease with which you can bring them all together, which you could not do were they all at a distance from their homes. Also, if you are routed, you can easily reform, both because a considerable part of your army will survive since it has had a refuge at hand, and because reinforcements have not to come from a distance, so that though you may have to risk all your forces, you will not be risking your whole fortune, whereas abroad you would be risking your whole fortune but not risking all your forces. There have, indeed, been some who, in order to weaken the enemy more, have allowed him to advance for several days into their country and taken a number of towns, so that he may weaken his army owing to the garrisons he leaves in all of them, and thus it will be easier to face him in battle. Let me now say what I think about this. I think a distinction must be made, for either I have my country well equipped with arms, as the Romans had, and as the Swiss have, or I have a country ill equipped with arms, as the Carthaginians had, and have the King of France and the Italians today. In the latter case, the enemy should be kept at a distance, for since your virtue lies in money, not in men, as soon as anything gets in the way of you attaining it, you may be undone, nor does anything impede you so much as does war in your own domains. This is exemplified by the Carthaginians, who, so long as their country was unoccupied, could use the revenue to make war on the Romans, but when it was attacked, could not withstand Agathocles, nor had the Florentines any remedy against Castruccio, lord of Lucca, because he waged war on them within their own lands, so that to defend themselves they had to submit to Robert of Naples. Yet after Castruccio's death, those same Florentines summoned up the courage to attack the Duke of Milan in his own territory, and strove to deprive him of his kingdom. Thus they displayed great virtue in waging war away from home, but great cowardice when it was near at hand. But when states are strongly armed, as Rome was, and as the Swiss are, the more difficult it is to overcome them the nearer they are their homes. For such bodies can bring more forces together to resist attack than they can to attack others. Nor in this point am I impressed by the authority of Hannibal, for it was resentment and self-interest that made him say what he did to Antiochus. For had the 3 disastrous defeats Hannibal inflicted on the Romans in Italy taken place in Gaul in the same space of time, the Romans had undoubtedly been undone, since they would have been unable to make use of the forces that survived, as they were able to do in Italy, nor would it have been so easy for them to reform, nor yet would they have been able with such forces to withstand the enemy as they were able to do. One does not find that in attacking a foreign country they ever send out armies of more than 50,000 men, but for home defense they put under arms against the Gauls after the First Punic War 1,800,000. Nor would they have been able later to vanquish them in Lombardy as they vanquished them in Tuscany, because against so numerous an enemy they would not have been able to bring to at that distance such strong forces, nor have fought them under the same advantageous conditions. The Cimbri broke up a Roman army in Germany, and the Romans had no way to repair their defeat. But when the Cimbri arrived in Italy, and against them the Romans could bring all their forces to bear, they were undone. The Swiss are easy to beat when away from home, whither they cannot send more than 30 or 40,000 men. But to defeat them at home, where they can muster 100,000, it is very difficult. In conclusion, therefore, I say again that a ruler who has his people well armed and equipped for war should always wait at home to wage war with a powerful and dangerous enemy, and should not go out to meet him. But that one who has ill-armed subjects and a country unused to war should always meet the enemy as far away from home as he can. Both of them will, in this way, defend themselves better, each in his own degree. 13. Men rise from a low to a great position by means rather of fraud than of force. It is quite true, I think, that seldom, if ever, do men of low position obtain a high rank except by force and by fraud, though there are, of course, others to whom rank comes merely by way of gift or inheritance. Nor do I think that force by itself ever suffices, whereas instances can easily be found in which fraud alone has sufficed. Anyone who has read the life of Philip of Macedon, or that of Agathocles the Sicilian, for instance, or others of that ilk, will see that from an extremely low, or at any rate a low, position, they rose either to a kingdom or to a very great power. Xenophon, in his life of Cyrus, calls attention to the necessity for deceit, for in view of the amount of fraud used in the first expedition Cyrus made against the king of Armenia, and of the fact that it was by means of deceit, not by means of force, that he acquired his kingdom, one cannot but conclude from such actions that a prince who wishes to do great things must learn to practice deceit. Besides this, Xenophon also makes him deceive Cyaxares, king of the Medes, his maternal uncle, in various ways, and shows that without such frauds Cyrus could not have attained the greatness he did attain. Nor do I think that anyone can be found whose position at the outset was humble, but who subsequently acquired vast power simply by the use of open and undisguised force. But it can quite well be done by using only fraud, as was done by Giovanni Galeazzo, in order to deprive his uncle Bernabo of his position as ruler in Lombardy. And what princes have to do at the outset of the career, republics also must do until such time as they become powerful and can rely on force alone. Since in all her decisions, whether by chance or by choice, Rome took all the steps necessary to make herself great, she did not overlook fraud. She could not at the start have been more deceitful than she was in the means she took, as we were saying just now, to acquire allies, since under this title she made them her servants, as was the case with the Latins and the other peoples round about. For she had first availed herself of their arms in order to subjugate neighboring peoples and to build her reputation as a state, and then, having subdued them, she increased to such an extent that she could beat anyone. Nor would the Latins ever have realized that in reality they were mere slaves if they had not seen the Samnites twice defeated and forced to accept Rome's terms. Since this victory increased the already great reputation of the Romans with more distant rulers, who thus felt the impact of her name, though not of her arms, envy and suspicion were aroused in those who did see and feel the weight of her arms, among them the Latins. So strong became this envy and this dread that not only the Latins, but also the colonies Rome had in Latium, together with the Campanians, who a short while before had been defended by Rome, joined in a conspiracy against her. The Latins provoked this war the way in which most wars are provoked, as has been pointed above, namely, not by attacking the Romans, but by protecting the Sicydians against the Samnites, who had made war on them with Rome's sanction. That the Latins were moved to do this because they recognized the deceit Rome had practiced is shown by the words Titus Livy puts into the mouths of Annius Saturninus, the Latin praetor, when speaking before the allied council. For if under cover of treaty between equals it has been possible to reduce us to servitude, and so forth. It is clear, therefore, that when the power of the Romans was first beginning to grow, they did not fail to use fraud, of which it is always necessary that those should make us use who from small beginnings wish to rise to sublime heights, and the better they conceal it, as the Romans did, the less blameworthy it is. 14. Men often make the mistake of supposing that pride is overcome by humility. There are to be found numerous cases in which humility is not only no help, but is a hindrance, especially when used in dealing with arrogant men, who, either out of envy or for some other cause, have come to hate you. This, our historian assures us, was the cause of the war between the Romans and the Latins. For when the Samnites complained to the Romans that the Latins had attacked them, the Romans were unwilling to forbid the Latins to make war on them, because they did not wish to annoy them. Yet by doing so, they not only annoyed them, but intensified their animosity and caused them the sooner to become open enemies. This is borne out by what the prefect, Annaeus, the Latin praetor, said to the aforementioned council of the allies. "You have tried their patience by refusing them troops. Who can doubt that this has made them angry? Yet they have put up with it. They have heard that we have an army ready to attack their allies, the Samnites, yet they have not stirred from the city. To what is this marked modesty due, if it be not that they are aware of the strength of our respective forces, ours and their own?" This shows very clearly how much the patience of the Romans intensified the arrogance of the Latins. A ruler, therefore, should never forget his dignity, nor, if he cares for his honor, should he ever waive a point agreed upon unless he can enforce it, or thinks he can enforce it. For it is almost always better, when your position is such that you cannot by this way make the concession, to let it be extracted by force rather than by threat of force, because if you yield to a threat, you do so in order to avoid war, and more often than not, you do not avoid war. For those before whom you have thus openly demeaned yourself by yielding will not stop there, but will seek to extort further concessions, and the less they esteem you, the more incensed will they become against you. On the other hand, you will find your supporters growing cooler towards you, since they will look upon you as weak. But if, as soon as you become aware of your adversary's intentions, you prepare to use force, even though your forces be inferior to his, he will begin to respect you, and since those with which you were allied will now esteem you, they will be ready to help when you begin to arm, which they would never have done had you given up. This applies where you have but one enemy, but if you have more, the wiser course is to hand over some of your possessions to one of them so as to win him to your side, even after war has been declared, and that you may detach a member of the confederation which is hostile to you. 15. The decisions of weak states are always fraught with ambiguity, and the slowness with which they arrive at them is harmful. In regard to the topic we have been discussing, in connection with the outbreak of war between the Romans and the Latins, it may be remarked that in all consultations it is well to come to the point which is under discussion, not to remain ever hesitant and uncertain in regard to the real issue. This is brought out very clearly in the consultation the Latins held when they were considering whether to leave the Roman Confederation. For when the Romans came to be aware of the ill humor with which the Latin peoples had become imbued, in order to clear up the situation and to see whether they could not retain the loyalty of these peoples without having recourse to arms, they suggested to them that they should send 8 citizens to Rome to discuss the matter. On hearing this, the Latins, conscious that they had in many things acted contrary to the wishes of the Romans, held a council to decide who should go to Rome and to instruct them what to say. During the discussions of the questions in council, Annaeus, their praetor, got up and said, "It seems to me to be of the utmost importance in this business that you should consider what it is to be done rather than what it is to be said. It will be easy, when you have arrived at a decision, to accommodate words to acts." This assertion is undoubtedly true, and every prince and every republic should ponder it well. For where there is ambiguity and uncertainty as to what others want to do, it is impossible to choose the right words. But once one's mind is made up, and it has been decided how to implement one's decision, it is easy to find the right words. I am the more ready to call attention to this, since I have often noticed what harm such ambiguity has done in public affairs, to the detriment and to the discredit of this republic of ours, where there is doubt as to which course to choose, and it requires courage to decide. This ambiguity will always be found, if on the point under discussion the decision rests within weak men. Slow and tardy decisions are no less harmful than are ambiguous decisions, especially if the point and issue is whether to support is to be given to an ally. For by such slowness nobody benefits, and to oneself it does harm. Slowness in arriving at decisions proceeds either from lack of courage and of strength, or from malevolence on the part of those with whom the decision rests. In the latter case, men who are moved by their own appetites to seek either the downfall of the government or the fulfillment of some other aim of theirs, do not let the discussion follow its normal course, but impede it and raise difficulties. Whereas good citizens, even though they see that popular indignation is bent on taking a pernicious course, never place obstacles in the way of a decision, especially if the matter be urgent. After the death of Hieronymus, the tyrant of Syracuse, when this great war between the Carthaginians and the Romans was still going on, a dispute arose among the Syracusans as to whether they should ally themselves with Rome or with Carthage. So great was the ardor displayed by each side that the issue remained doubtful, and no decision was taken until Apollonides, one of the chief men in Syracuse, delivered an extremely pungent speech in which he showed that, though no blame attached those who were in favor of an alliance with the Romans, nor those who wanted to throw in their lot with the Carthaginians, Florentinians, yet ambiguity and slowness in reaching a decision was to be depreciated, for it was clear to him that this wavering would bring about the ruin of a republic, whereas should they arrive at a decision, whichever way it went, they might expect good from it. Nor could Titus Livy have shown more clearly than does this passage the harm that comes from indecision. He shows it, too, in an incident involving the Latins, for when the Lavinians were asked to help them against the Romans, the former put off deciding so long that when they were actually marching through the city gate with an army to give succor to the Latins, news came that the Latins had been defeated. Whereupon Milonius, their praetor, said, "For this short journey the Romans will make us pay dear." For had they decided at first either to help or to not help the Latins, they would by not helping them have avoided annoying the Romans, and by helping them in good time might by means of their combined forces have enabled them to win. But by their procrastination they stood to lose either way, as happened in point of fact. Nor, had the Florentines noted the significance of this incident, would they have suffered such losses nor such vexations at the hands of the French as they did when the French king, Louis XII, moved into Italy on his way to attack Ludovico Sforza, Duke of Milan. For, when the king was considering this expedition, he sought to come to terms with the Florentines, and their representatives, who were then at his court, agreed that they should remain neutral, and that, in return, when the king came to Italy, their form of government should be maintained, and Florence should receive his protection. The city was given a month to ratify this agreement. Its ratification, however, was put off, owing to the imprudence of those who sympathized with the cause of Ludovico, so that when the king was already on the point of victory, and the Florentines then wanted to ratify the agreement, their proposal was not accepted, since the king knew that they were forced to take this line, and were not doing it voluntarily out of friendship for him. This cost the city of Florence no small sum of money, and came near to causing a revolution, which on another occasion was actually brought about in this way. The course they took was the more harmful, in that it in no way helped the Duke, who, had he won, would have displayed much more hostility towards the Florentinians than did the king. Although the evils to which this weakness gives rise in the republics I have already discussed under another heading, I decided to avail myself of the opportunity provided by a fresh incident to repeat what I had said, since it seems to me to be a matter of which republics, especially those that resemble ours, should take careful note. Discourses 16 through 18. The Army, its discipline, and component parts. 16. How far the discipline of troops in our day falls short of that maintained in days gone by. The most important battle ever fought by the Romans in any war with another nation was the battle they fought with the Latin peoples in the consulate of Torquatus and Decius. For everything shows that, just as the Latins, by losing, became a subject people, so the Romans would have become a subject people had they not won. This is the view held by Titus Livy, for in all respects the two armies were alike in discipline, virtue, truculence, and in numbers. The only difference was that the commanders of the Roman army had more virtuosity than those of the Latin army. One notes, too, how in the conduct of this battle there occurred two unprecedented incidences of which there have been but few examples since. Namely, to strengthen the resolution of the soldiers and to make them obey orders, of the two consuls one killed himself and the other killed his son. The parity which Titus Livy says held between two armies was due to their having for a long time waged war together, and consisted in their having the same language, the same discipline, and the same kind of arms. For in drawing up troops for battle, they used the same formation, and both units and officers bore the same names. It was essential, therefore, since both in strength and in virtue they were equal, that something extraordinary should take place whereby to strengthen the ardour and truculence of the one rather than the other. For as we have remarked on other occasions, it is on determination that victory depends, since, so long as it lasts in the breaths of those who are fighting, an army will never turn tail. And in order that it might last longer in the breasts of the Romans than with the Latins, it came about, owing partly to chance and partly to the virtue of the consuls, that Torquatus had to kill his son and Decius to kill himself. When pointing out this parity in strength, Titus Livy describes in detail how the Romans drew up their armies and how they disposed them for battle. He has done this at considerable length, so I shall not repeat it all. I shall discuss the points which I deem worthy of note, points which are ignored by all present-day commanders, with the result that there is a grave lack of proper order alike in drawing up armies and in battle. From Livy we gather that in the Roman army there were three main divisions, for which the Tuscan term three ranks may be used. They called first the Hastati, the second Principes, and the third Triarii. Each had its own cavalry attached. In drawing them up for battle, they put the Hastati in front. In second place, immediately behind the Hastati, they put the Principes. In the third, all covering precisely the same space, they placed the Triarii. The cavalry pertaining to each of these divisions they put on the right and on the left of the three formations. These mounted troops, on account of their formation and their position, were called alae, because they looked like two wings attached to the body. They drew up the first rank, consisting of the Hastati, who were in front, in close formation so that they might thrust forward and hold up the enemy. The second rank, consisting of the Principes, since they were not to be engaged at the outset, but were to come to the aid of the first should they be beaten or hard-pressed, they did not draw up in such close formation, but kept their lines thinner so that this rank could receive the first rank without disturbing its formation, should the latter be overcome by the enemy and have to fall back. The third rank, consisting of the Triarii, were drawn up in yet thinner lines than the second, so as to receive the first two ranks, comprising the Principes and the Hastati, should need arise. When the ranks had thus been drawn up in this formation, they went into battle, and should the Hastati be forced back or defeated, they fell straight back upon the thinner ranks of the Principes, and in the two ranks, thus united to form one compact body, resumed the fight. Should these ranks be beaten and forced to retreat, they retired upon the thinner ranks of the Triarii, and all three ranks together, forming one body, renewed the fight. But should they be overcome, the day was lost, since they had no further chance to reform. Wherefore, since every time this last rank of Triarii became engaged, it meant danger to the army, there arose a proverb, "It all depends on the Triarii," or, as we say in the Tuscan idiom, "We have played the last stake." As generals in our day have abandoned all other traditions and pay no attention to any point in ancient military discipline, so they have abandoned it in regard to this point, which is of no small importance. For where an army is so drawn up as to be able to reform 3 times during a battle, to lose the day, luck must go against it 3 times, and the valor of those attacking must be sufficient to beat it 3 times over. But an army that can withstand but one attack, as is the cause with all Christian armies, may easily lose. For if it become in any way disorganized, or its valor be but indifferent, its dance of victory goes. The inability of our armies thrice to reform is due to their having dropped the custom of receiving one rank into the other. This, in turn, is due to their being in present-day battle formations one of 2 defects. Either they station their ranks one alongside the other, and makes their formation broad in extent but thin in the line of attack, which makes them weaker owing to their lack of depth. Or, when to make them stronger, they actually draw up the ranks in Roman fashion. Then, since no arrangement is made for the first to be received by the second, when the first is routed, all get mixed up together and defeat themselves. For if the rank in the front gets the worst of it, it collides with the second, and if the second wants to advance, it is impeded by the first. Hence, when the first falls back on the second, and the second on the third, so much confusion arises that the whole army is frequently ruined, should the least misadventure befall. At the Battle of Ravenna, in which Mesure de Faux, who commanded the armies of France, was killed, a well-fought battle as things go today, both the Spanish and the French armies were drawn up in one of the ways just described, i.e., each of the 2 armies advanced with all its troops drawn up shoulder to shoulder so they both presented but a single front, which was a much greater in extent than it was in depth. This is always their procedure when they are operating on a large plain, such as they had at Ravenna. For realizing the disorder a retreat causes when troops are arranged in files, they avoid this when they can by making their front broad, as has been said. But should the available space be narrow, they put up with the aforesaid bad arrangement without providing any remedy. And in the same bad formation, they ride through the enemy's country, whether to loot it or to perform any other military maneuver. Again, San Rigolo in the territory of Pisa, as also at other places in which the Florentines were routed by the Pisans during the war which took place between the Florentines and that city owing to its having rebelled after Charles, King of France, passed through Italy, the disaster was entirely due to the allied cavalry, which, being in front and having been repulsed by the enemy, fell back on the Florentine infantry and broke it up, so that the rest of the troops all turned tail. Messer Siracco del Borgo, once a captain of the Florentine infantry, has also often stated in my presence that he has never been routed except by the cavalry of his allies. The Swiss, who are masters of modern warfare, when fighting on the French side, make it their first care to station themselves on the flanks, so that, should the allied cavalry be driven back, it will not clash with them. Yet, though such things are both easy to understand and very easy to carry out, nonetheless, there has not appeared yet of any of our contemporary generals who has adopted the ancient formations and amended the modern ones. And though they may again have the threefold army formation, called respectively the vanguard, the main body, and the rear guard, it serves no purpose other than that of disposing men in billets. Moreover, when they make use of it, as was said above, it rarely happens that the self-same fortune does not befall all these bodies, since many, to cover their ignorance, assert that the destructive power of artillery does not in these days permit the use of so many ancient practices. I propose to discuss this question in the following chapter, and to inquire whether artillery renders it impossible to display the valor of the days gone by. 17. In what esteem artillery should be held by armies at the present time, and whether the opinion universally held in its regard is sound. When, in addition to what I have just written, I consider how many open battles, in which in our time the French call days and the Italians call feat of arms, were fought by the Romans at different times, there comes to my mind the common opinion so many hold, an opinion which would have had it that, had there been artillery in those days, it would not have been possible for the Romans to have conquered provinces and some have made peoples become their tributaries so easily as they did, nor would they have been able in any way to make such bold acquisitions. They allege, too, that the use of these destructive weapons prevents men from employing and displaying their virtue as they used to do of old. And as a third point, they add that it is the more difficult than it was then to come to an engagement, and that it is impossible to keep to the ancient usages. In fact, war before long will be reduced to the question of artillery. I do not think it beside the point to discuss whether this view is sound, or to inquire whether artillery has increased or has lessened the strength of armies, and whether it has deprived good generals of, or has provided them with, an opportunity for acting virtuously. So let me begin by dealing with the first of these claims, namely that Roman armies of old would not have made the acquisitions they did make, if in those days there had been artillery. In reply to this, I would point out that wars are either offensive or defensive. Hence, we must first ask to which of these two kinds of warfare artillery is the most useful or the most dangerous. Though there is something to be said for either view, yet I'm convinced that artillery is incomparably more harmful to defenders than to those who attack. The reason why I say this is that the defenders are either in a walled town or encamped behind a stockade. If they are within a walled town, either it is small, as are most fortresses, or it is large. In the first case, it is all up with the defenders, or for the force of artillery is such that no wall can withstand it, not even the thickest, for more than a few days. Hence, if those within have not a goodly space into which to retire and dig trenches and build ramparts, they are doomed. Nor can they withstand the attack of an enemy determined to force his way through a gap in the walls, even if they have artillery to help them. For it is an accepted maxim that against a heavy-massed attack artillery is powerless. For this reason, the defending of towns against the fury of ultramontane attacks has not been successful, but against the assaults of Italians they have been highly successful, for the latter do not attack en masse, but in detachments, a form of attack for which much the best name is the skirmishing. To advance thus coolly in such weak formation towards a breach in the walls where there is artillery is to advance to certain death, and against such attacks artillery is of service. But when the attackers form a dense mass and come on one after the other to a breach in the walls, they get through anywhere unless held up by trenches and ramparts. Artillery will not hold them, for though some get killed, there will not be so many killed as to prevent a victory. That this is so is shown by the many towns stormed by the Ultramontes in Italy, and especially by that of Brescia. For when this town rebelled against the French, who still held the citadel on behalf of the King of France, in order to prevent the raids being made on the town from the citadel, the Venetians fortified the whole of the street leading down from the citadel to the city with artillery, placing it both in front and on the flanks and in any other convenient place. But of this Monsieur de Foix made no account. On the contrary, with a squadron of his cavalry, who dismounted, he got right through the artillery and took the city, nor do we hear that the artillery caused him any appreciable loss. So that the defenders of a small town, as we have said, when they find their walls laid low and have no space into which to retire behind ramparts and entrenches, but have to rely on their artillery, are speedily undone. If you are defending a large town, where you have all you need for a withdrawal, artillery is still of far greater use to those who are outside than to those who are within. First, because if artillery is to do any damage to those who are outside, you must needs raise it above the level of the ground. For, if on the level, every little trench the enemy digs and every rampart he puts up will afford him security, then you can do him no harm. So much so that, having raised your artillery and dragged it into some recess in the walls, or having in some other way elevated above the ground, you will then meet with two difficulties. First, you cannot bring into action artillery of the same size and power as those outside can avail themselves of, since in a small place it is impossible to manipulate large pieces. Secondly, should you succeed in getting there, you will not be able to construct a reliable and safe ramparts whereby to protect said artillery, which can be done quite easily outside on terra firma, where there are all the inconveniences and as much space as anyone can want. Hence it is impossible for the defenders of a town to have their artillery in high positions when those who are outside have enough artillery, and that of a powerful kind. And if they are driven to place it in a low position, it is in large part useless, as has been said. Consequently, the defenses of a city has to be carried out by hand-to-hand fighting, as was done of old, supported by artillery of a very light caliber. Wherefore, though some slight benefit may accrue from this light artillery, it brings with it a disadvantage which counterbalances the advantages due to artillery, because, owing to the heavy artillery, the walls of towns are demolished and lie flat, buried as it were in ditches, so that, when it comes to hand fighting, the defenders have a worse time of it than they had before, since their walls have been battered down or their trenches filled up. These engines of war, therefore, as was said above, are of more use to the besiegers of towns than they are to the besieged. As to the third point, if your camp has been placed behind a stockade so as to avoid open battle unless it suits your convenience, and is to your advantage, I claim that in this case you are ordinarily no better off in regard to preventing an engagement than was the case in the old days, and that there are times when, on account of artillery, you may be at a greater disadvantage. For, should the enemy come upon you, and have a slight advantage in position, as may easily happen should he find himself on higher ground than yours, or should you, on his arriving, not yet have made your trenches and dug yourself in, straightway, and without your being able to do anything about it, he will dislodge you, and you will have to quit your fortified position and join battle. This happened to the Spaniards at the Battle of Ravenna. They had fortified themselves on the banks of the Ronco, but the earthworks they had thrown up were not sufficiently high, and the French had a slight advantage in position, so that they were compelled by artillery to quit their fortifications and join battle. But suppose, as should usually be the case, that the site you have chosen for the camp is above that occupied by the enemy, and that its earthworks are good and strong, so that, owing to your position and the other preparations you have made, the enemy does not dare to attack. It will be found that in such a case recourse will be had to the methods that were used in ancient times when someone had his army in a position in which he could not be attacked, namely, to scouring the country, taking or laying siege to towns that are friendly to you, and cutting off your supplies, so that you will be forced under such conditions to leave your camp and come out into the open, where artillery, as I shall presently point out, cannot do much. In view, therefore, of the reasons for which the Romans made war, and seeing that almost all their wars were of the offensive and not the defensive type, it would seem that what we have said about the above holds good, namely, that it would have been to their advantage and would have speeded up their conquests had there been artillery in those days. As to the second charge, which alleges that men cannot display their valor as they used to do of old, on account of the artillery, I admit it is true that where men in small detachments have to expose themselves, there is greater danger now than then, should they have to scale walls of a town or to make assault of this kind, not with a compact body of troops, but individually, first one appearing and then another. It is also true that the officers and generals of an army are more exposed to the danger of death now than then, since anywhere may come under artillery fire, nor does it help them to be in the last squadron or to be supported by very brave men. One finds, nonetheless, that rarely does either of these two dangers occasion any out-of-the-way loss, for the walls of well-fortified towns cannot be scaled, nor are attacks on them made with weak troops. If a town is to be taken, it has to be besieged, just as it was of old, nor, even when it is taken by assault, are the dangers much greater now than they were then, for the defenders of towns, even in those days, did not lack equipment for launching projectiles, which, if not so terrifying, were no less effective in the matter of killing men. As to the death of officers and army commanders, in the last 24 years, during which there have been wars in Italy, there have been fewer causes than there were during 10 years of war in olden times. For, except for Count Ludovico della Mirandola, who was killed at Ferrara when the Venetians attacked that state a few years ago, and for the Duke of Nemours, who was killed abroad at Cerignola, artillery has not killed anybody, for Monsieur Defoe was killed by a sword, not by a cannonball. Hence, if men do not, as individuals, display their valor, it is not due to artillery, but to bad methods and to the weakness of modern armies. For, since they lack valor as a whole, they cannot display it in part. To their third allegation, which is that it is impossible to bring about a hand-to-hand fight, and that war will eventually become a matter of artillery, I reply that this statement is altogether false, and will always be looked on as false by those who want their armies to display in their operations the virtue of ancient times. For it behooves him who wants to form a good army to accustom his men by means of sham fights or real fights to engage the enemy at close quarters, sword in hand. Hence he should rely more on infantry than on cavalry, for reasons which will presently be given. And if he does rely on infantry, trained as we have said, artillery becomes quite useless, for it is easier for infantry when engaging the enemy to avoid cannonballs than it was of old for them to avoid an attack by elephants or by chariots armed with scythes, or other unfamiliar weapons, such as the Roman infantry had to encounter. Against such devices they always found a remedy, and against artillery would the more easily have found a remedy in that ancient time during which it may harm you is shorter than that during which elephants and scythed chariots could do you harm. For the latter throw you into disorder during a battle, whereas the former is a nuisance only before the fight begins, and this nuisance infantry could easily avoid either by availing themselves of such cover as the sight offers, or by lying flat on the ground when a volley comes. Experience, however, has shown that this is unnecessary, especially as a defense against heavy artillery, for which heavy artillery the range cannot be so nicely adjusted. Either the fire is too high and does not get you, or it is too low and falls short of you. Again, when armies come to hand-to-hand conflict, it is as clear as day that neither heavy nor light artillery can hurt you, for if the enemy place it in front, you capture it, and if he puts it behind, it hits his own folk before it hits you. And while on the flanks, it cannot do you so much damage, but that you can go and get it, so that in the end it all comes to much the same thing. Nor is there much question about this, for it is clear from the case of the Swiss, who at Navarra in 1513 were without either artillery or cavalry, yet went for the French army, which was supported by artillery in fortified positions, and found no difficulty on this account in breaking it up. The reason for this, besides what I said above, is that if artillery is to function, it must be protected either by walls or trenches or earthworks, and if either form of protection is lacking, it either gets taken or becomes useless, just as happens when men have to defend it in pitched battles and open engagements. Nor can it be used on the flanks except in the way the ancients used projectile launching devices. Such instruments were then placed outside the main body in order that they might function outside the ranks, and should those who used them become overcome at any time by cavalry or other forces, they took refuge behind the regular troops. Those who expect anything more from artillery do not understand it properly, and place their trust in what can easily let them down. And if, by using artillery, the Turk gained a victory over Sophie and the Sultan, this was solely in virtue of the panic caused among their cavalry by its unfamiliar noise. On coming, then, to the end of this discourse, my conclusion is that artillery is useful to an army provided it be backed by valor such as was displayed of old, but without this it is not of the least use against a valorous army. 18. That infantry should be more highly esteemed than cavalry is shown by the authority of the Romans and by the example of ancient military practice. It is possible to give many reasons and to cite many cases showing clearly how much greater esteem the Romans had for foot soldiers than for cavalry in all military operations, and how upon this basis they drew up all plans for their forces. Numerous instances illustrate this, among others the battle fought with the Latins near Lake Regillus, where, when the Roman army began to give way, to support them, some troops on horseback were ordered to dismount and fight on foot, by which means the battle was renewed and a victory gained, from which it is obvious that the Romans had more confidence in their men when on foot than when mounted. They used this expedient in many other battles, and always found it the best remedy in dangerous situations. Nor can this be countered by the opinion expressed by Hannibal, when during the battle of Cannae he noticed that the consuls had made their cavalry dismount, and joked about it, saying, "I should have liked it better that they handed the horsemen over to me bound." Though this opinion is voiced by a first-class man, yet if it be a question of authority, one should put more credence in a Roman republic and in the many first-class generals who were in it than in Hannibal alone. Furthermore, apart from an appeal to authority, sound reason can be adduced, for a foot soldier can get to many places which a mounted man cannot go. Infantry can be taught to keep their ranks, and when broken, know how to reform them, whereas it is difficult for cavalry to keep their ranks, and impossible for them to reform when their ranks are disorganized. Besides which, one finds that horses, like men, sometimes have little spirit and sometimes have a great deal. And quite often it happens that a spirited horse is ridden by a timid man, and a timid horse by a man of spirit, and of whichever kind the disparity may be, the result is subversive of utility and order. Infantry, when well drawn up, can easily break cavalry, but with difficulty are routed by them. This view is corroborated not only by many instances, both ancient and modern, but also by authors who prescribe rules for the conduct of civic affairs, and in them show that wars were the first fought with cavalry, since there were then no rules for drawing up infantry. But when these were made, it was at once recognized that infantry are more useful than cavalry, but it does not follow from this that cavalry is not essential to an army alike for the purpose of scouting, of raiding, and pillaging the country, of pursuing the enemy when in flight, and again a partial counterpose to the cavalry of the adversary. But it is infantry that could constitute the basis and sinews of an army, and that should be held in a higher esteem. Among the sins committed by Italian princes who have made Italy the slave of the foreigner, There is none more grave than that of having held this arm of small account and of having devoted all their attention to mounted troops. This mismanagement is due to the perversity of captains and to the ignorance of those who hold office. For the Italian militia, having lost all official status during the last 25 years, had become like soldiers of fortune. It occurred to the militia that their reputation would be made if they had the armed forces while the rulers had none. Since then they could not maintain a large number of infantry continually in their pay, and they had no subjects of whom they could avail themselves, and since a small number would not make their reputation, they turned to cavalry. For with 200 or 300 cavalry in his pay, the reputation of a condottiere was safe, and the pay was not as such as to prevent him from getting it from ministers of state. So the more easily to obtain their end, and to keep up their reputation, they made light of all the esteem and repute in which infantry was held, and applied it instead to their own cavalry, an abuse which has grown to such an extent that even of the largest armies the infantry constitute but a fraction. It is this practice, conjoined with the numerous other abuses associated with it, that has made the Italian militia so weak that Italy has become an easy prey, downtrodden by all the ultramontanes. To show yet more clearly what a mistake it is to prefer cavalry to infantry, I shall take another example from Rome. The Romans were encamped before Sora. From the town there came forth a troop of cavalry to attack their camp. The Roman master of horse advanced to meet them with his cavalry. When they met, luck would have it that at their first encounter the officers commanding both bodies of troops were killed. Though without their leaders, the fight none the less went on, and that they might the more easily get the better of their foes, the Romans dismounted and forced the enemy's cavalry in order to defend themselves to do the same, by which means the Romans gained victory. Than this example none shows better how much more virtue there is in infantry than cavalry. For in other actions consuls made the Roman cavalry dismount that they might help the infantry, who were hard pressed and were in need of support. But in this case they dismounted, not to help the infantry, nor yet to engage the enemy's foot soldiers, but because, while fighting as cavalry against cavalry, it occurred to them that, since as cavalry they could not prevail, they might win more easily by dismounting. Whence I infer that it is only with the great difficulty that infantry, when properly drawn up, can be overcome, except by other infantry. Crassus and Mark Antony, 2 Romans, overran the domains of the Parthians for many days, with very few cavalry, but plenty of infantry, though against them they had vast numbers of Parthian cavalry. Crassus, with part of the army, got killed, but Mark Antony fought valiantly and escaped. Nonetheless, in the misfortune the Romans suffered. We see how much more valuable the infantry were than cavalry, for the country was vast, mountains scarce, streams very scarce, and the sea far away, and no conveniences at hand. Yet Mark Antony, as the Parthians they themselves admitted, saved himself by his outstanding virtue. Nor did the Parthian cavalry, numerous as it was, ever dare to try conclusions with his army. And if Crassus was left behind, he who studies closely the records of his doings will see that it was by deceit rather than by force that he was undone. For, in spite of all his troubles, the Parthians never ventured to attack him. On the contrary, they always went roaming about, intercepting his convoys, making promises which they did not keep, till they had reduced him to dire extremity. I should have been at more pains, I think, to prove that the virtue of infantry is more potent than that of cavalry, if there had not been so many recent examples which provide abundant evidence of this. There were the 9,000 Swiss we have already mentioned, who at Novara proceeded to attack 10,000 cavalry and as many infantry, and beat them, for the cavalry could not get at them, and they thought little of the infantry, since it consisted for the most part of Gascons and was badly organized. Then there were the 26,000 Swiss, who went as far as Milan to look for Francis, King of France, who had with him 20,000 cavalry, 40,000 infantry, and 100 pieces of artillery, and if they did not win the day, as they had done at Novara, they fought valiantly for 2 days, and though routed, got away with half their forces. Marcus Regilius Atilius had the courage to oppose not only cavalry, but elephants with infantry, and if his project did not succeed, it was not because his infantry were so lacking in virtue, but that he had not sufficient confidence in them to believe that they would overcome the difficulty. I repeat, then, that to get the better of well-disciplined infantry, it is necessary to bring against them better disciplined infantry, otherwise the case is plainly hopeless. In the days of Philip Visconti, Duke of Milan, there descended on Lombardy about 16,000 Swiss, whereupon the Duke, whose forces were then commanded by Carmignola, sent him with about 1,000 cavalry and a few infantry to meet them. Carmignola, unacquainted with their ways of fighting, attacked them with his cavalry, assuming that he would be able to break them at once, but they stood firm, and, having lost many of his men, he retired, being, however, a very brave man, who knew how to take fresh chances when circumstances changed. As soon as reinforcements came along to make up his strength, he went to meet them, told all his men-at-arms to dismount, and putting them at the head of his infantry, set out to attack the Swiss, for whom there was no escape, because Carmignola's men-at-arms, having dismounted and being well protected by armor, they could easily pierce the ranks of the Swiss without suffering suffering any harm, and having got through, could easily overcome them. The result was that of all the Swiss there remained alive only those whom the humanity of Carmignola chose to spare. I believe that many are aware of the difference in virtue that exists between these two types of troops, but so unhappy are these our times that neither ancient nor modern examples, nor its being admittedly a mistake, is sufficient to make modern rulers revise their point of view and realize that, if a province or a state is to keep up its military reputation, it is essential to reinstitute these services, to have them at hand, to restore their credit, to put fresh life into them, so that they may bring to the ruler both life and reputation. But as rulers have departed from these ways, so they have departed from others mentioned above, and in consequence acquisitions do harm to a state instead of contributing to its greatness, as will presently be pointed out. Discourses 19 through 23. The administration of conquered territory and other problems which admit of no middle course. 19. Acquisitions made by republics, when not well governed nor handled with the virtue the Romans displayed, contribute to the downfall, not to the advancement, of such republics. The erroneous views, based on ill-chosen examples, which have been introduced by our corrupt age, prevent men from considering whether to depart from the customary methods. Who could have persuaded an Italian 30 years ago that 10,000 infantry could attack 10,000 cavalry and as many infantry in an open plain, and not only engage them in battle, but defeat them, as happened at Novara, to state a case already mentioned more than once? Even though history is full of such examples, nobody would have credited them, and had they been credited, it would have been objected that in these days there are better arms, that a squadron of men-at-arms should be able to hurl itself against a rock, not merely an infantry battalion. With such false pretexts, men impair their judgment, nor would they have taken into account that Lucullus, with a small force of infantry, routed 150,000 cavalry under Tigranes, and that among these horsemen was a type of cavalry precisely similar to our own men-at-arms, nor yet again how this fallacy has been exposed by the example of ultramontane peoples. And since what history teaches about infantry is thus seen to be true, in the same way one should give credit to, and profit by, all other ancient practices. Were this done, republics and princes would make fewer mistakes, would be stronger in repelling an attack which should catch them unawares, and would not set their hopes on flight. Those who have had to handle a body politic would know better how to direct its policy, whether with a view to its expanding or to its holding its own, would realize that the right way to make a republic great and for it to acquire its empire is to increase the number of its inhabitants, to make other states as allies, not as subjects, to send out colonies for the security of conquered territory, to fund the spoils of war, to subdue the enemy by raids and battles, not by sieges, to enrich the public, but to keep the individuals poor, to attend with the utmost care to military training. And should this method of providing for expansion not meet with their approval, they should reflect that acquisitions made in any other way spell ruin to a republic, and so should bridle all ambition, provide well for the internal administration of their city-state by means of laws and customs, forbid it to make acquisitions, and look only to its defense, for which good preparation should be made. This is how the republics of Germany act, and because they have taken such steps, they enjoy freedom, and have enjoyed it for quite a spell. Nonetheless, as I have said elsewhere, when discussing the difference between constituting a state with a view to expansion and with a view to its maintaining the status quo, it is impossible for a state to remain forever in the peaceful enjoyment of its liberties and its narrow confines. For, though it may not molest any states, it will be molested by them, and when thus molested, there will arise in it the desire and the need for conquest. It will find, too, that when it has no external foe, there will be one at home, for this seems necessarily to happen in all large cities. That the republics of Germany have been able to live in this way, i.e. to maintain their status quo, and have lasted a considerable time, is due to the conditions which prevail in that country and are not found elsewhere, conditions without which it is impossible to maintain this type of polity. The party of Germany which I am speaking was, like France and Spain, subject to the Roman Empire, but when later the empire declined and the imperial title was transferred to Germany, its more powerful towns, owing either to the weakness or to the exigency of the emperors, began to free themselves, recompensing the emperor by the payment of a small annual tribute, so that little by little all the towns which had been directly dependent on the emperor and were not subject to any other prince purchased their freedom in like manner. It also happened that, whilst these towns were in the process of recovering their freedom, and their communes, in which were subject to the Duke of Austria, rebelled against him, among them Fribourg, the Swiss communes, and others like them. These communes prospered from the start and grew little by little to such dimensions that not only did they never fall under the Austrian yoke again, but they became the terror of all their neighbours. I mean the communes now called Switzerland. Germany, then, is divided among the Swiss, republics called free states, princes, and the emperor. And the reason why, amidst such diverse forms of constitution, wars do not arise, or if they do arise, do not last long, is the imperial title. For though the emperor has no power to enforce his will, yet he has such standing among them that he acts as an arbiter, and by interposing his authority, mediates between them, and at once puts an end to any dissension. The more important and the longest wars that have occurred there have been those between the Swiss and the Duke of Austria, and though for many years the emperor and the Duke of Austria have been identical, this has not enabled the Duke to overcome the boldness of the Swiss, among whose communes there would never have been an entente if they had not been driven to it. Nor has the rest of Germany given the emperor much help. For, on the one hand, the communes do not want to harm those who desire, like themselves, to be free, and on the other, the princes are in some cases unable to help on account of their poverty, and in others do not care to help since they envy the imperial power. These communities, therefore, are able to live content with their small dominions, since with respect to the imperial authority they have no cause to desire more. Within their walls they live united, because in the offing there is an enemy who, should there be internal disorder, would take the opportunity to subjugate them. Were conditions in Germany other than these, they would have to seek expansion and disrupt their present tranquility. And since elsewhere such conditions are not present, other states can not adopt this type of policy, but must needs expand either by means of confederations or in the way the Romans did. To adopt any other policy is to seek not life, but death and ruin, since conquests are harmful in 1,000 ways and for many reasons. For it is easy to acquire dominion, but not at the same time military strength, yet it must needs be that those who acquire dominion and not at the same time military strength are ruined. Nor can one who has been impoverished by wars acquire forces even if he be victorious, because he spends on them more than he gets from what he has acquired. This is what the Venetians and the Florentines did, and when the one held Lombardy and the other Tuscany, they were both much weaker than when the one was constant with the sea and the other with the boundaries 6 miles long. The trouble in all such cases is that with the will to acquire there does not go the wisdom to adopt the right method. This is the more blameworthy in that today there is less excuse for it, for the way the Romans behaved there is there for all to see, and had their example been followed, whereas the Romans had no example before them, and had to use their own intelligence in order to discover what to do. In addition to this, the conquests sometimes do no small harm even to a well-ordered republic, when the province or city it has acquired is given to luxurious habits, which can be taken up by those who have intercourse with it, as happened first to Rome when she acquired Capua, and then to Hannibal. Indeed, had Capua been so remote from Rome as to have had no remedy at hand for the mistake the soldiers made, or had Rome then been in any way corrupt, the acquisition of Capua would have undoubtedly have been the end of the Roman Republic. Titus Livy bears witness to this when he says, "Capua was by no means good for military discipline, for it afforded all manner of opportunities for indulgence, which obliterated the memory of the fatherland in the debilitated minds of the troops. In this way, cities and provinces avenge themselves on their conquerors without either battle or bloodshed, for when the latter have become imbued with their deplorable habits, they are liable to be beaten by anyone who attacks them. This could not be put better than it is by Juvenal in his Satires, where, in dealing with this question, he says that the acquiring of foreign lands familiarized the minds of the Romans with foreign customs, so that in place of frugality and its other high virtues, gluttony and self-indulgence took possession of it and avenged the world it had conquered. If, then, the acquisition of territory did so much harm to the Romans at a time when their conduct was conspicuous for prudence and virtue, what effect will it have upon states whose conduct is very far removed from this? Upon states which, in addition to the other mistakes they make, of which enough has been said above, in their wars use either mercenary or auxiliary troops, from which there results harm of diverse kinds, which will be mentioned in the next chapter. 20. On the dangers which accrue to the prince or to the republic that employs auxiliary or mercenary troops. If I had not in another of my works discoursed at length on the futility of mercenary and auxiliary troops, and on the advantage of one's own, I should make this discourse of greater length than I shall do. But having spoken at length elsewhere, I shall here be brief. Yet I cannot well omit to mention an important example which I have found in Titus Livy concerning auxiliary troops. Whereby auxiliary troops, I mean those that a prince or republic sends to help you under commanders appointed and paid by that prince or that republic. Coming then to Livy's evidence, I would point out that after the Romans in 2 different places had routed 2 Samnite armies with the armies which they had sent to help the Capuans, and had thus freed the Capuans from the war the Samnites had been waging against them, they decided to return to Rome. But lest the Capuans, when deprived of their help, should again fall prey to the Samnites, they left 2 legions in the neighborhood of Capua to defend them. These legions began to enjoy an idleness which was bad for them, so much so that, though it would mean being false to their fatherland and to the respect they owed the Senate, they thought of taking up arms and making themselves lords of the country which by their valor they had defended, for it seemed to them that the inhabitants were unworthy to possess good things which they knew not how to protect. When this became known, it was stopped by the Romans and matters were put right. as we shall explain at length when we come to speak of conspiracies. I repeat, then, that of all kinds of soldiers, auxiliaries are the most hurtful, for over them the prince or the republic who accepts their aid has no authority at all. The only person who has authority over them is the person who has sent them, for auxiliary troops are, as I have said, troops sent to you by a ruler under their own commanders with their own standards, and in his pay, as was the army which the Romans sent to Capua. Such soldiers, when they have won, often prey on those who have commissioned them in the same way as they prey on those against whom they have been commissioned to fight, moved thereunto either by the malignity of the prince who sends them, or by their own ambition. Though the Romans had no intention of breaking the alliance and the agreement they had made with the Capuans, yet so easy did the conquest of Capua seem to these soldiers that they were readily induced to consider depriving the Capuans of their lands and of their independence. Of this numerous examples might be given, but I shall be content with this one, and with that afforded by Rhegium, which was robbed of its independent life and of its territory by a legion which the Romans sent to guard it. A prince or a republic, therefore, ought first to adopt any course rather than bringing into the state for its defense auxiliary troops, when it means that they will be entirely dependent on them. For any treaty or convention, however hard, that they can make with any enemy will be light as compared with such an alternative. For those who study closely the past and discuss the present will find that for each case that has led to good results, there are any number that turned out to be mistakes. Nor can an ambitious prince or republic have a better chance of getting a hold of a city or a province than to be asked to send his armies there to protect it. Hence, he who is so ambitious as to invoke such help, not merely to defend himself but to attack others, is seeking to acquire what he cannot keep, for by what he has used to get it, it can easily be taken away. Yet so great is a man's ambition that in striving to slake his present desire, he gives no thought to the evils that in a short time will follow in its wake, nor is he stirred by the lessons of the past, as I have shown in regard to this and to other matters. For, if he were moved by them, he would see that the greater the liberality he displays towards his neighbors, and the more adverse he is to seizing their lands, the more ready they will be to throw themselves into his lap, as will be shown below from what happened in the case of the Capuans. 21. The first praetor the Romans sent out was to Capua, 400 years after they had first begun to make war. How much the methods used by the Romans in acquiring territory differed from those at present used to extend the dominion of a state has been sufficiently explained in a previous discourse, and also how the Romans let the towns which they did not destroy live under their own laws, even in the case of those which did not become their allies, but when they surrendered were made subjects, for in such a case the only token of the imperium exercised by the Roman people was the imposing of certain conditions, the which being observed, they allowed them to retain their own form of government and their prestige. These methods, we know, were kept up until they had gone beyond Italy and begun to reduce kingdoms and states to provinces. Of this, the best example is that of the first praetor the Romans ever sent to a place outside Rome, namely to Capua, for it was not ambition that induced them to send him, but because the Capuans had asked for one, since they were at loggerheads with one another and thought it necessary to have a Roman citizen in their city who should put matters to right and reunite them. Moved by this example, the people of Antium, which in like case were constrained to ask that a prefect should be sent to them, apropos of which incident, and of this new way of exercising authority, Titus Livy says that not only the arms of the Romans, but Roman law began now to prevail. We see, therefore, how much this procedure contributed to the increase of Rome's power. For cities, especially those accustomed to freedom, or to being ruled by a native of the place, rest more tranquil and content under a government they do not see, though it may bear on them somewhat hardly, than under a government with which they are brought into daily contact, and which thus reminds them daily of their servitude. There is also a further advantage gained by the ruler. It is this: since the judges and magistrates who exercise civil and criminal jurisdiction over the citizens are not his ministers, their judgments cannot cause difficulty or bring discredit on the ruler, so that many grounds for hating and calumniating with him are thus avoided. In addition to other examples, one might adduce from antiquity to prove this truth of this. There has recently occurred one in Italy. For Genoa, as everybody knows, has more than once been occupied by the French, and in all cases except the present one, the king sent a French governor to rule in his name. But on the present occasion, not by choice but because he could not help it, the king let the city govern itself, and the governor appointed was a Genoese. Nor can it be doubted that, should anyone inquire as to which of these two methods brought greater security to the king and to the king's authority there, or greater contentment to the people, he would certainly favor the last method. Besides which, men are more inclined to throw themselves on your lap the more averse you appear to have them there, and for their liberties fear less, the more humane and the more easygoing is your treatment of them. It was the easygoing ways and the generosity of the Romans that made the Capuans hasten to call in a Roman praetor, whereas had the Romans shown the least desire to send one there, they would at once have become suspicious and kept clear of them. But what need is there to go to Capua and Rome for instances of this, when they are to hand in Florence and Tuscany? Everybody knows how long it is since the city of Pistoia came of her own accord under the dominion of Florence. Everybody is also aware what hostility there has been between the Florentines and the Pisans, the Lucchesi and the Sienese. The diverse attitude here adopted did not proceed from the small value the Pistonians set on their liberty as compared with the others, nor from their thinking less of themselves than the others did, but from the Florentines having always treated the Pistonians as brothers and the others as enemies. It was this that made the Pistonians so quick and so willing to accept the Florentine suzerainty, and that made and still makes the others exert all their efforts not to come to this. Had the Florentines, whether by means of confederations or by helping them, been easygoing with their neighbors instead of treating them roughly, they would unquestionably please the lords of Tuscany today. I do not mean to say that armed forces should not be used, but that they should be used only as a last resort when other means prove inadequate. 22. How frequently erroneous are the views men adopt in regard to matters of moment. How frequently men form false opinions has been observed and is still observed by those who happen to be witness to their decisions, the which, unless made by men of first-class ability, are very often the reverse of being sound, and because in corrupt republics, especially in untroubled times, men of first-class ability are ousted by the envy and ambitious scheming of others, men fall back on what by common error is judged to be good, or else by those who are seeking popularity rather than the common good. Such mistakes are discovered afterwards when things go wrong, and recourse is then have of necessity to those who in peaceful times had been, as it were, forgotten, as in its proper place in this connection we shall endeavour to show. There sometimes occur also events about which men who have had no great experience of affairs are easily mistaken, since such happenings have plausible features which make men believe that the outcome in such a case will be what they have persuaded themselves it will be. These remarks are made with reference to what Numicius, the praetor, persuaded the Latins to do after they had been beaten by the Romans, and to what many believed a few years ago when Francis I, King of France, set out to acquire Milan, which the Swiss were defending. I would point out, then, that after the death of Louis XII, Francis of Anguleme succeeded to the crown of France and was anxious to recover the Duchy of Milan, which, a few years before, had been occupied by the Swiss, supported by Pope Julius II. To facilitate his attack, he desired to find help in Italy, so, besides the Venetians whom Louis had won over, he approached the Florentines and Pope Leo X, under the impression that his task would be easier if he could first win them over, since the King of Spain's troops were in Lombardy and other forces belonging to the Emperor were in Verona. Pope Leo declined to accede to the king's wish, but was persuaded by his advisers, so it was said, to remain neutral, for they pointed out that by adopting this course he would be certain to emerge victorious, for it did not suit the Church to have as powers in Italy either the king or the Swiss, but being anxious to restore Italy to its former freedom, it was essential to free it from servitude to either, and since it was impossible to overcome both of them, either singly or both together, the best course was to let one of them overcome the other, and then for the Church with her allies to fall on the victor. Nor could there be a better opportunity than the present, since both armies were in the field, and the Pope had his forces in readiness and could send them to the confines of Lombardy, near to both the armies, under the pretext of protecting his own territory, where they could remain until the battle took place. This might reasonably be expected to be sanguinary on both sides, since both armies were good ones, and hence should leave the victor so weak that it would be easier for the Pope to attack and break him, which would be a glorious thing, since it would leave him to master of Lombardy and the arbiter of all Italy. How false this opinion was is seen by the event, for when the Swiss were overcome after a long fight, the forces of the Pope and of the King of Spain did not dare to attack the victor, but made ready for flight, and even this would not have helped them, had it not been that the king, for humanity's sake, or because indifferent, did not look to a second victory, but was content to make peace with the Church. Though when viewed from a distance there were grounds which, made by the view here adopted, seemed sound, it was in fact utterly false, for it rarely happens that a victor loses very many of his troops, since they are killed in battle, not in flight, and in the ardor of combat when men are face to face, but few get killed, especially if the battle lasts but for a short time, as it usually does. While even if it lasts long, and many of the victor's men get killed, the repute gained by the victory and the terror he now inspires much more than compensates for the loss suffered by the death of his men. Hence, anyone who sets out to attack an army, when in his opinion has been weakened by a fight, will find themselves mistaken unless his own army be such that at any time, even before the victory, he could afford to fight. In that case, he might win or he might lose, according to his luck and to his virtue. But an army which has just fought and gained a victory would be an advantage rather than a disadvantage in his regard. This is put beyond question by the experience the Latins underwent and the mistake the praetor Numicius made, and by what happened to those who believed him. For when the Romans had defeated the Latins, Numicius went about shouting all over Latium that now was the time to attack the Romans, since they were weakened by the battle they had fought with them, and all they had gained was a nominal victory, which in reality was a defeat owing to the losses they had suffered, so that any small force which should make a fresh attack of them would finish them off. So the peoples who believed him raised a fresh army and were routed forthwith, wherein they suffered a loss which is always suffered by those who lend an ear to such advice. 23. When events required that the Romans should pass judgment on a subject peoples, they avoided a middle course. The state of things in Latium was now such that it could stand neither peace nor war. The most unhappy of all unhappy positions is that of a prince or of a republic which is reduced to such extremities that it can neither accept peace nor sustain war. Such a position arises when the conditions of peace are too severe, and war means that either they become the prey of their allies or that they remain prey to their enemies. All such extremities are brought about by bad counsels and bad decisions, made without first estimating carefully the forces at one's disposal, as has been said above. For the republic or the prince who measures his forces well will with difficulty be brought to the pass which the Latins were led. For they came to terms with the Romans when they ought not to have done so, and declared war on them when they ought not to have declared war, and by so doing created a situation in which the enmity and the friendship of the Romans was from their point of view equally harmful. The Latins therefore were conquered and brought into complete subjugation, first by Menelaus Torquatus, and then by Camillus, who, having forced them to surrender unconditionally, and having put garrisons in all the Latin towns and everywhere taken hostages, returned to Rome and announced to the Senate that all Latium was in the hands of the Roman people. Since what Camillus said is important and deserves the attention of all rulers who would emulate his example should the occasion arise, I shall here quote the words which Livy puts in the mouth of Camillus, for they bear witness to the way in which the Romans extended their dominions, and also to the fact that judgments pronounced by their government they always avoided a middle course, and preferred extremes. For government consists in nothing else but so controlling subjects that they shall neither be able to, nor have cause to, do you harm, which may be done either by making quite sure of them by depriving them of all means of doing you harm, or by treating them so well that it would be unreasonable to desire a change of fortune. All this is made quite clear, first by Camillus' statement, and then by the judgment the Senate came to in this regard. These are Livy's words. The immortal gods have vouchsafed to you the power to decide whether Latium is to be or not to be. Its future lies in your hands. In so far as the Latins are concerned, it rests with you to make a peace which shall be perpetual, either by punishing them cruelly or by pardoning them. Do you think it advisable to be brutal towards those who have surrendered and have been conquered? If so, you can wipe out the whole of Latium. Do you want, after the manner of our forefathers, to augment the Roman state by admitting to the conquered citizenship? The material whereby to increase it to its great glorification lies ready to hand. Of a surety, that empire is most secure in which obedience is conjoined with happiness. It behooves you then to subjugate them while their minds are so stunned that they know not what to expect, either by punishing them or by becoming their benefactor. Having heard this proposal, the Senate came to a decision, which followed the lines the council had laid down, which was that, after duly considering one by one each town, they should either treat all citizens of importance generously or wipe them out. By conferring on those they treated generously exemptions and privileges, granting them citizenship, and using every endeavor to make them loyal, and by demolishing towns of the others, sending colonies there and taking inhabitants back to Rome, or so dispersing them that they could no longer do harm, either by appeal to arms or by machinations. Nor did they ever adopt a middle course, as I have said, of importance, towards men and other rulers should imitate them in this. This is what the Florentines should have done, when in 1502 Arezzo and the whole of the Val di Chiane revolted. If they had done this, they would have made their dominion secure. Florence would have become a great city, and they would have acquired the Lebin Sarum, which they lacked. But they adopted the middle course, which is the most prejudicial that men can take. Some of the Aretines they banished, some of they condemned to death, and from all they took away the honors and positions sanctioned by the ancient customs of that city. But they left the city intact. And if in their discussions any citizen advised that Arezzo be destroyed, the reply was given by those who it seemed to be more wise, was that to destroy it would do little credit to the Republic, since it would appear that Florence had not the forces to hold it. Such arguments are based on appearances, not on truth. For on this showing, no parricide, or criminal, or notorious person would be put to death for fear lest, by doing so, a ruler would show that he had not the power to curb a particular individual. Those who are of this opinion do not see that, whenever men individually, or a whole city offends against a state, its ruler has, both an example to others and for his own security, no alternative but to wipe them out. Honor consists here in being able and knowing how to castigate it, not in being able to hold it, thereby incurring 1,000 risks. For the ruler who does not punish an offender in such a way that he cannot offend it again is deemed either an ignoramus or a coward. The policy of the Romans in this matter is again confirmed, if there be need to confirm it, by the judgment they passed on the Praeverenatis. In what Livy says of it, two things should be noted. First, as has been said above, that subject people should either be generously treated or wiped out. Secondly, how helpful a generous disposition may be, and how helpful it is to tell the truth when one is called on to give evidence before prudent men. The Roman Senate had meant to pronounce judgment on the Privurnates, who had rebelled, but had subsequently been forced to return to the Roman obedience. The people of Privernum had sent many of their citizens to ask the Senate to pardon them. When they came before the Senate, one of them was asked by a senator what punishment he thought the Privurnates deserved, to which the man of Privurnates replied, "That which men deserve who think themselves worthy of freedom." To which the consul answered, "Supposing that we remit the penalty, what kind of peace can we expect to have with you?" His answer was, "If you are good to us, a loyal perpetual peace. If you treat us badly, not a long one." Though many were dissented, the wiser among the senators then said, "We have been listening to those who are both men and free men, nor do I think it possible for any people or any man to remain longer than he can help in a situation which he deplores. Peace treaties can be relied on when they are made voluntarily. Loyalty is not to be expected from those who are ready to become slaves." In consequence of this speech, it was decreed that the Privurnates should become Roman citizens, and should share in the privileges and honors which citizenship conferred. Those whose minds are set on liberty and nothing but liberty, it was said, are worthy to be made true Romans. Such was the pleasure which this straightforward and generous answer gave to generous minds. To have given any other would have been deceitful and base. Those who believe that men are not like this, especially when they have been accustomed either to being free men or to looking on themselves as free men, are as mistaken, and decisions based on this mistake are neither good for those that make them, nor satisfactory to others. Hence come frequently rebellions and the ruin of states. But to return to our main topic, from 2 judgments passed on these Latin peoples, I conclude that, when sentence has to be passed on cities which are powerful and accustomed to a life of freedom, either they should be eliminated or they should be caressed, and any other decision is futile. At all costs should the middle course be avoided, for it is hurtful, as it was to the Samnites when they caught the Romans in the Chaldean forks and were unwilling to follow the advice of the old man, who told them either to treat the Romans as honorable men and to set them free, or to kill the lot. For they took the middle course, disarmed them, and marched them under the yoke, and then set them free, burning with shame and indignation, with the result that, later on, they learned to their cost that the old man's advice was sound, and their own decision was harmful, as will be shown at more length in its proper place. Discourses 24 through 27. Mistakes often made in connection with war. 24. Fortresses in general are more harmful than useful. To the wiseacres of our time, it may perhaps seem a foolish thing that when the Romans wanted to ensure the loyalty of the people of Latium and the city of Privernum, it did not occur to them to build any sort of fortress to curb them and keep them loyal, especially as in Florence it is an accepted principle, so our wiseacres say, that Pisa and other such cities should be held by means of fortresses. Had the Romans been of their caliber, it would undoubtedly have occurred to them to build fortresses, but since their virtue, judgment, and power was of different order, they did not do so. So long as Rome enjoyed freedom and was loyal to her institutions and to her efficient constitution, she never held either cities or provinces by means of fortresses, save where they were already built. In view, then, of the way the Romans acted in this matter, and of the way rulers act today, it seems to me worthwhile considering whether it is good to build fortresses and whether they are harmful or useful to those who build them. It must be borne in mind, then, that fortresses are constructed as defense either against enemies or against subjects. In the first case they are unnecessary, and in the second case harmful. Let us begin by explaining why the second case they are harmful. I maintain that when a prince or republic is afraid of its subjects and fears they may rebel, the root cause of this fear must lie in the hatred which the subjects have for their rulers, a hatred which is due to their misbehavior, and a misbehavior which is due to their fancying they can hold them by force, or to their foolish way of governing them. And one of the things that makes rulers believe in force is the fact that they have fortresses to fall back on. For when mismanagement gives rise to hatred, it is mainly due to a prince or republic having fortresses. And, when this is the case, fortresses are far more harmful than useful. For, in the first place, they make you more foolhardy and violent in dealing with your subjects, as has been said. Next, they do not afford you internally that security you fancy they do. For no force and no violence is of the least use in controlling your people except under one of 2 conditions. Either you have a good army, which you can put in the field, as the Romans had, or your people are so exhausted, spent, disorganized, and divided that they cannot unite to do you hurt. For if you reduce them to poverty, though despoiled they still have arms, and if you disarm them, their fury will provide them with arms. If you kill their leaders and suppress all other signs of insurrection, like the heads of the Hydra, other leaders will arise. If you erect fortresses, they are useful in times of peace, because they give you more courage in ill-treating your subjects. But in times of war, they are quite useless, for they will be attacked both by your enemies and by your subjects, and against both it is impossible for them to stand. And if there ever was a time when they were useless, it is now on account of artillery. For against its fire it is impossible to defend such small places when there are no embankments behind which men can retire, as we have shown above. In discussing this question, I am going to particularize. Do you, my prince, with your fortress, want to keep a firm hand on the people in your city? Do you, be you a prince or a republic, want to tighten your grip on a city you have taken during a war? I tell you, if you be a prince, that as a means of controlling your citizens, nothing can be more futile than a fortress for the reasons I have given. It makes you quicker to use, and less careful in using harsh measures, and by such measures you make them long for your downfall, and they become so furious that, for this very reason, your fortress will afford you no protection. So obvious is this, that a wise and good prince never constructs fortresses if he wants to remain good, and to avoid providing his sons with a reason for wanting to become bad. For he would have them rely not on fortresses, but on their subjects' goodwill. And if Count Francesco Sforza, having become Duke of Milan, was reputed a wise man, and yet built a fortress in Milan, I maintain that in this he was not wise, and the result has provided that this fortress did harm to his heirs instead of affording them security. For with a fortress they thought they were safe, and could oppress their citizens and subjects, so lost no opportunity of doing them violence, with the result that they came to be detested beyond all measure, and lost their state to the first enemy who attacked them. Nor was this fortress any protection, or of any service to them in time of war, while in time of peace it did them much harm, since if they had not had it, yet had been so unwise as to treat their citizens harshly, they would have realized their danger sooner, and would have withdrawn from it. In which case they would have been able to put up a more spirited resistance to the French attack with loyal subjects but without a fortress, than with a fortress and disloyal subjects. In no way then do fortresses help you, for you will lose them either through a treachery of their keepers, or by some violent attack, or by their being starved out. While if you do want them to help you, and to enable you to recover a state you have lost, in which there remains to you only a fortress, you must have an army with which to attack those who have driven you out. And when you have such an army, you will recover your state anyhow, even if there be no fortress there. And this the more easily when your men are friendly and have not been badly treated, owing to the arrogance of fortunes and stills. Experience then shows that this Milanese fortress was not the least use to either the Sforzas or to the French, when with either of them things went wrong. On the contrary, to both it brought disaster and ruin, in that it prevented them from considering whether there might not be a more honest way of maintaining their position. Guidobaldo, Duke of Urbino, the son of Frederick, who was highly esteemed in his day as an army commander, was expelled from his state by Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI. When later, owing to an accident, he got back, he had all the fortresses in that district razed to the ground, since he thought them mischievous. For with respect to his people who were fond of them, he did not need fortresses, and so far as his enemies were concerned, he realized he could not protect the fortresses, since he would require to have an army in the field to defend them, so he resolved to get rid of them. Pope Julius, when he had expelled the Bentivogli from Bologna, erected a fortress in that city, and afterwards caused its inhabitants to be cruelly oppressed by one of his governors, so that they rebelled, and straightway he lost the fortress, which thus did not help him, but harmed him inasmuch as had he acted otherwise, it would have helped him. Niccolo da Castello, father of the Vitelli, on returning to his country from which he had been exiled, at once pulled down 2 fortresses which had been built there by Pope Sixtus IV, for he held that it was not the fortress, but the affection of his people, which would preserve his state for them. But of all such cases, the most recent and the most noteworthy in every way, as illustrating the futility of building fortresses and the utility of demolishing them, is what happened at Genoa not long ago. Everybody knows that in 1507, Genoa rebelled against King Louis XII, King of France, who came in person with all his forces to reconquer it, and that, on recovering it, he constructed a fortress stronger than any at present known, since, situated on the point of a hill, which juts into the sea, called by Genoese Codafa, it was, owing to its position and to a number of other circumstances, impregnable, and commanded the port and a large part of the city of Genoa. It nonetheless came about that in 1512, when the French were driven from Italy, Genoa rebelled, despite the fortress. Ottaviano Fregoso seized the government, and after a siege of 16 months, in which he used all possible devices, he starved the fortress out. Everyone then expected, and many advised, that it should be kept as a refuge in case of emergency. But Fregoso, like a prudent man, destroyed it, for he recognized that it is not a fortress but the wills of men that keep rulers in power. Thus, instead of relying on a fortress, he relied on virtue and sound sense, and so held his position and holds it still. And whereas to change the government of Genoa 1,000 infantry used to suffice, its adversaries have since attacked it with 10,000 and have done it no harm. Hence one sees that dismantling a fortress did not hurt Ottaviano, and erecting one did not help the king. For so long as he could come with an army into Italy, he could recover Genoa without having a fortress there. But when he could not come into Italy with an army, he could not hold Genoa, though he had the fortress. Thus, constructing the fortress was expensive to the king, and losing it shameful, whereas to Ottaviano the reconquering of the fortress brought glory, and the demolishing of it advantage. We now come to the republics which erected fortresses not in their native land but in towns which they have acquired. If the instances already given of France and Genoa do not suffice to show the fallacy involved, it should be enough if I cite those of Florence and Pisa. The Florentines erected fortresses to hold the city of Pisa, not considering that, since the Pisans had always been hostile to Florentine power, had enjoyed freedom and regarded rebellion as a means to freedom, it was necessary, if they were to maintain Pisa, to adopt the Roman method, i.e., either to make it an ally or to destroy it. For the virtue of the fortresses became evident on the arrival of King Charles, to whom they surrendered owing either to the bad faith of their custodians or for fear of worse to come. Whereas if there had been no fortresses, the Florentines would not have based on them their power to hold Pisa, nor would the king have been able by means of them to deprive the Florentines of that city, for the means they had taken thus far might perchance have enabled them to keep it, and unquestionably would not have proved more disastrous than the fortresses. I conclude, therefore, that for the purpose of holding one's own country, fortresses are hurtful, and that for the purpose of holding acquired towns, they are futile. The authority of the Romans is enough for me here, for around the towns they wanted to hold by force, they did not build walls, but pulled them down. And if against this my view anyone should cite in ancient times the case of Tarentum, and in modern times Brescia, both of these places were regained, thanks to fortresses, after their subjects had revolted. I answer thus. To recover Tarentum, Fabius Maximus, at the beginning of his year at office, was sent with a whole army, which would have sufficed for its recovery, even if there had been no fortress there. And though Fabius made use of it, if it had not been there, he would have adopted other means which would have produced the same effect. What use there is in a fortress I do not know, if, to recover a town, one needs a consular army and a Fabius Maximus to command it. Moreover, that the Romans would have recovered it in any case, is seen from the example of Capua, where there was no fortress, but which the Romans retook by the valor of the army. But let us turn to Brescia. I maintain that what happened in that rebellion is rare occurrence. Rarely when a town rebels, does it happen that the fortress remains in your hands and that you have a large army in the neighborhood, as the French had then. For Monsieur Defoe, the king's commander, had an army at Bologna, and when he heard that Brescia was lost, he went without delay to deal with the revolt. In 3 days reached Brescia, and with the assistance from the fortress recovered the town. Here, again, then, for the fortress at Brescia to be of any use, it needed a Monsieur Defoe and a French army to relieve it after 3 days' march. The case of Brescia, therefore, is not enough to refute examples of the opposite kind. For in wars recently waged, numbers of fortresses have been taken and retaken with the same fortune that has attended the taking and retaking of open country, not only in Lombardy, but in the Romagna, in the kingdom of Naples, and in every part of Italy. As to building fortresses for defense against external foes, I maintain that they are unnecessary where peoples or kingdoms have good armies, and that to those who have no such armies they are useless. For good armies without fortresses suffice for defense, and fortresses without good armies are no defense. This is borne out by the experience of men of high repute as rulers and in other matters. For instance, the Romans and the Spartans. For if the Romans did not build fortresses, the Spartans not only abstained from doing this, but did not permit their cities to have walls, because they chose to rely for defense on the virtue of the individual, and wanted no other. Hence, when a Spartan was asked by an Athenian whether the walls of Athens did not look fine, he answered, "Quite, provided it be ladies who live there." The ruler, then, who has good armies, may sometimes find it useful, though not essential, to have fortresses on the coast and on the frontiers of his domain to hold off the attack of an enemy till he gets it properly going. But if he has not a good army, to have fortresses within his state or on his frontier is either harmful or useless. Harmful because he so easily loses them, and when lost they make war on him, or if they should chance to be so strong that the enemy cannot capture them, they get left behind by the hostile army and so come to be useless. For when good armies do not meet with very strong opposition, on entering a country they pay no attention to cities and fortresses, which they may leave behind them. We see this in ancient history, just as we have seen it done by Francesco Maria, who in quite recent times, when on his way to attack Urbino, left behind him 10 of the enemy's cities without bothering about them. The ruler, then, who can muster a good army, can do without fortresses, and the ruler who has not a good army had better not build them. The best thing he can do is to fortify the city where he dwells, and to keep it provisioned and its inhabitants well disposed, so as to hold off an enemy's attack till he can either come to terms or to get outside help to relieve him. All other plans are expensive in times of peace and useless in times of war. In view, then, of all that I have said, it will be seen that, as the Romans were wise in their other institutions, so too were they prudent when they decided in the case of the Latins and the Privanates to dispense with the fortresses and took more virtuous and wiser means of securing their loyalty. 25. To attack a divided city in the hope that its divisions will facilitate the conquest of it is a bad policy. There was so much discord between the plebes and the nobility in the Roman Republic that the Ventes, in conjunction with the Etruscans, thought that this disunion would enable them to destroy the power of Rome. Having, therefore, formed an army and invaded Roman territory, the Senate set Gaius Manlius and Marcus Fabius to engage them. When the army they were leading drew near to the army of the Ventes, the latter kept on attacking and vilifying the Roman name with insults and abuse, and so great was their rashness and insolence that the Romans became united instead of disunited, and, when it came to a fight, broke and defeated the enemy. Thus one sees, as we have said above, how mistaken men are when coming to decisions they rely on discord, and how often, when they think they have a sure thing, they lose. The Ventes thought that if they attacked the Romans when disunited, they would overcome them, but their attack caused the Romans to unite and brought about their own ruin. For discord in a republic is usually due to idleness and peace, and unity to fear and to war. Had the Ventes been wise, then, the more disunited they found the Romans to be, the more studiously they should have refrained from going to war with them, and have striven to get the better of them by the artifices of men used in times of peace. The way to set about this is to win the confidence of the city which is disunited, and, so long as they do not come to blows, to act as an arbitrator between the parties, and when they do come to blows, to give tardy support to the weaker party, both with a view to keeping them at it and wearing them out. And, again, because stronger measures would leave no room for any doubt that you were out to subjugate them and to make yourself their ruler. When this scheme is well carried out, it will happen, as always, that the end you have in view will be attained. The city of Pistoia, as I have said in another discourse, and apropos of another topic, was acquired by the Republic of Florence by just such an artifice, for it was divided, and the Florentines supported now one, now the other party, and without making themselves obnoxious to either, led them on until they got sick of their turbulent ways of living, and in the end came to throw themselves voluntarily into the arms of Florence. The city of Siena has never changed its form of government, and with the help of the Florentines, except when their help was weak and infrequent, for, when it was frequent and strong, its effect was to make that city united in defense of the government in power. I wish to add to the above-mentioned examples a further example. Filippo Visconti, Duke of Milan, several times made war on the Florentines, relying on their disunion, and in all cases came out the loser, so that when he was bewailing these attacks, he used to say that the follies of the Florentines had involved him in an expenditure of 2 millions in gold to no purpose. It remained then, the Ventes and the Tuscans were mistaken on this point, as was said above, so that in the end there came a battle when the Romans conquered them, and in like matter will others find themselves mistaken, should they imagine that by such means and in such circumstances they can bring people into subjugation. 26. Scorn and abuse arouse hatred against those who indulge in them without bringing them any advantage. I hold it to be a sign of great prudence in men to refrain alike from threats and from the use of insulting language, for neither of these things deprives the enemy of his power, but the first puts him more on his guard, while the other intensifies his hatred of you and makes him more industrious in devising means to harm you. This is seen in the case of the Ventes, whom we were discussing in the previous chapter. Besides the injury done by war, they abused the Romans by word of mouth, a thing which every sensible general should prevent his soldiers from doing, for such language does but exasperate the enemy and move him to vengeance, nor, as has been said, does it in any way interfere with his attack, so that in fact they are weapons which turn against you. Of this a notable instance occurred in Asia. When Clobades, the Persian commander, had been besieging Amida for a considerable time, he grew weary of the tiresome business and decided to withdraw. While he was striking camp from the townsmen, exhilarated by their victory, all climbed on the walls and used every sort of abuse, calumniating and accusing and upbraiding the enemy for his cowardice and poltroonery. This so annoyed Clobades that he changed his mind, and indignant at the injustice, returned to the siege, and in a few days had taken and sacked the city. The same thing happened to the Ventes, who, as I have said, were not content to make war on the Romans, but also spoke of them contemptuously, going up to the stockade surrounding their camp and shouting abuse at them. This annoyed their troops much more than fighting did, so that, whereas they had at first fought unwillingly, they now pressed consuls to join the battle, with the result that the Ventes, like those mentioned above, were punished for their contumacy as they deserved. Good army commanders and good republic rulers should take all appropriate measures to prevent the use of abusive language and taunts, whether in a city or in their army, and whether used towards one another or towards the enemy. For if used towards the enemy, there ensue the aforesaid inconveniences, and still worse inconveniences if used one towards the other, unless precautions be taken, as they have always been taken by prudent men. When the Roman legions, left in Capua, conspired against the Capuans, as will be narrated in due course, and in connection with this conspiracy, a mutiny arose, subsequently quelled by Valerius Corvinus, among other points in the convention he drew up, it prescribed the severest penalties on those who should reproach any of the troops for having taken part in the mutiny. Tiberius Gracchus, who during the war with Hannibal had been put in command of a certain number of slaves, whom, owing to the shortage of men, the Romans had armed, made a special point of the capital punishment he prescribed for anyone who should reproach any slave with his servitude. We see, then, how harmful the Romans thought it to calumniate others, or to reproach them for a shameful deed, as has been said. For then there is nothing that inflames the mind more, or arouses greater indignation, whether the taunt be true or be said in jest. For smart sayings, when they border on the truth, leave a bitter taste behind them. 27. Prudent princes and republics should be content with victory, for, when they are not content with it, they usually lose. Speaking to the disparagement of an enemy, it is usually due to the arrogance aroused in you by victory or by the false hope of victory. False hopes of this kind not only cause men to make mistakes in what they say, but also in what they do. For when such hopes enter men's breasts, they cause them to dispense with caution, and often to miss the chance of obtaining a sure thing in the hope, but by no means the certainty of improving on it. This matter is worth considering, since very often men make mistakes in regard to it, detrimental to their country. Wherefore, since it cannot be so clearly proved by an appeal to reason, I shall cite examples, both ancient and modern, in support of it. After routing the Romans at Carnae, Hannibal sent messengers to Carthage to announce his victory, and to ask for reinforcement and supplies. During the discussion in the Senate as to what should be done, Hanno, an old and prudent Carthaginian citizen, urged that it would be wise to use the victory as a lever for securing peace with the Romans, which they should be able to attain with honor since they had beaten them, instead of waiting till their own defeat caused them to make it. The aim of the Carthaginians should be to make it clear to the Romans that to have fought with them sufficed. Having won, they should not now go on and spoil their chances in the hope of improving on them. This course was not adopted by the Carthaginian Senate, though it recognized later the wisdom of it when the opportunity had been lost. When Alexander the Great had conquered the whole of the East, the Republic of Tyre, which in those days ranked high and was powerful, since, like Venice, it was on the coast, recognized Alexander's greatness, and so sent ambassadors to say that they were ready to become his loyal subjects and to obey his behests, but that they were not prepared to receive either him or his troops in their town. Alexander was indignant that a city should want to shut in his face a door that the whole world had thrown open, declined to accept their conditions, and set out to besiege the city. But this sea-girt and fortunate town was so well stocked with provisions and other supplies needed for its defense that after 4 months Alexander saw that it was taking him longer to win glory in the case of this city than it had taken him to acquire many other places, and hence decided to make peace overtures and to concede the point that Tyre had asked. But the men of Tyre, elated with his success, not only refused to accept his terms, but killed the envoy who came to arrange matters. Whereupon Alexander, becoming indignant, put such life into the siege that he took and demolished the city, and either killed or made slaves of its inhabitants. In 1512, a Spanish army invading the dominions of Florence, with a view to restoring the Medici and levying a tax on the city, acting on behalf of fifth columnists who had led him to expect that, once they crossed the border, they would take up arms in their favor. On entering the plain of the Arno, they found none of them, and, as they were short of provisions, they made overtures of peace. The people of Florence were too proud to accept them, hence the loss of Prato and the ruin of that state. The rulers of states, when attacked, therefore, cannot make a greater mistake than to refuse to come to terms when the forces attacking them are a good deal stronger than their own, especially if the overtures are made by the enemy. For the terms will never be so hard, but that in them some benefit will be accrued to those who accept them, so that in a way they will share in the victory. The people of Tyre, for instance, should have been content that Alexander had accepted the conditions which he had at first refused, and the victory thus gained would have been considerable, since with their armed forces they had compelled a great man to condescend to their wishes. It should, in like manner, have sufficed the people of Florence that the Spanish army had yielded to any of their demands instead of fulfilling all their own, for this, too, would have been a considerable victory. For what the Spanish army wanted was to change the form of government in Florence, to put an end to its attachment to France, and to levy tribute. If of these 3 things the Spaniards had gained the last 2, and the people of Florence had gained the first, that is, the retention of their form of government, each would have acquired a certain honor and a certain satisfaction. Nor would the people have been likely to trouble much about the other 2 things, so long as their lives were safe. Nay, even had they seen there was good and almost certain chance of greater victory, they should not have placed themselves wholly at the discretion of fortune and ventured their last stake, which it is never wise to risk unless driven to it. When Hannibal, who had enjoyed greater glory in Italy for 16 years, left it on being recalled by the Carthaginians to help his own country, he found Hasdrubal and Syphax routed, the kingdom of Numidia lost, and the Carthaginians cooped up within their own walls, destitute of hope except what he and his army could bring. Realizing that his country was reduced to its last stake, he was determined not to risk that till he had tried all other remedies, and so was not ashamed to sue for peace, since he was convinced that if there was any hope at all for his country, glory, it lay in this and not in war. When peace was refused, he did not decline to fight, though bound to lose, since he felt that he could still win. But if he had to lose, he could at least lose gloriously. If, then, Hannibal, who was so full of virtuosity, and had his army still intact, preferred peace to war when he saw that, by losing, his country would be enslaved, what should a man do who has neither the efficiency nor the experience of Hannibal? Yet there are men who make this mistake, in that to their hopes they set no bound, and are ruined because they rely on such hopes, and take no account of other things. Discourses 28 through 33. Rome's dealing with neighboring states and cities in peace and war. 28. How dangerous it is for a republic or prince not to avenge an injury done either to the public or to a private person. What is likely to make men indignant with others may easily be learnt from what happened to the Romans when they sent out the 3 Fabia as ambassadors to the Gauls, who were about to attack Tuscany, and in particular Clusium. The people of Clusium had appealed to Rome for help against the Gauls. Hence the Romans sent the 3 Fabii as ambassadors to the Gauls to insist in the name of the Roman Republic on their abstaining from a war with the Tuscans. When they arrived at their destination, the ambassadors, who were better at acting than speaking, found the Gauls and the Tuscans about to join battle, whereupon they were foremost to enter the fray. It thus came about that when the Gauls became aware of this, their annoyance with the Tuscans was turned against the Romans, and their indignation was intensified when the Gauls, having complained to the Roman Senate through their ambassadors of this unfairness, and demanded that the aforesaid Fabii be handed over to them to compensate for the harm they had done, they were not only handed over or punished in some other way, but an election was held in which they were made tribunes with consular power. Consequently, when the Gauls saw those being honored who ought to have been punished, they took it as an affront, and an indignity offered to themselves, and inflamed with indignation and anger, marched on Rome and took it, except for the capital, a disaster which the Romans brought on themselves through their disregard of justice, for since their ambassadors had offended against the law of the nations, they should have been punished instead of being honored. This leads one to consider how important it is for every republic and every prince to take account of such offenses, not only when an injury is done to a whole people, but also when it affects an individual. For if an individual is grievously offended either by the public or by a private person, and does not receive due satisfaction, he will, if he lives in a republic, seek to avenge himself, even if it lead to the ruin of that republic. And if he live under a prince and has a spark of manliness, will never rest content till he has in some way or other wreaked vengeance on him, even though he see that, in doing so, he will bring disaster on himself. In verification of this, there is no finer or more relevant instance than that of Philip, king of Macedon, the father of Alexander, in whose court there was a handsome and noble young man, Pausanias. With him, Attalus, one of the chief men in Philip's entourage, was enamored, and had on several occasions sought to get him to assent, but found that he had no liking for such things. So, seeing that he could not get what he wanted otherwise, he decided to set a trap for him and to use force. He gave, therefore, a great banquet, which Pausanias and other noble barons attended, and when they had had their fill of food and wine, he had him seized and bound. Then he not only used force in order to gratify his lust, but, to his greater shame, got others to treat him in the same disgusting way. Of this affront, Pausanias complained several times to Philip, who, having kept him for a time in expectation of vengeance, not only did not avenge him, but made Attalus governor of the Grecian province. Pausanias, therefore, seeing his enemy honored instead of being punished, gave full vent to his indignation, not only against the perpetrator of the deed, but against Philip, who had not avenged it. So one morning, the day of the solemn wedding of Philip's daughter, who was being married to Alexander of Epirus, he killed Philip as he was going out to the temple for the celebration, standing between the 2 Alexanders, his son and his son-in-law. Of this incident, which is akin to that which happened to the Romans, all who rule should take note, so that they may never esteem any man so lightly as to think that, if injury be added to injury, the injured person will not consider how to vindicate himself, even though it involve him in all manner of dangers and entail his own downfall. 29. Fortune blinds men's minds when she does not wish them to obstruct her designs. If one ponders well the course of human affairs, it will be seen that many events happen and many misfortunes come about against which the heavens have not been willing that any provision at all should be made. Since this statement holds good in the case of Rome, which was so conspicuous alike for virtue, religion, and orderly conduct, it is no wonder that the same thing happens yet more often in cities and provinces which are lacking in these respects. There is a well-known passage in which Titus Livy shows at length and with great force the power that heaven exercises over human affairs. He says that, with a view to making the Romans recognize its power, heaven first caused the Fabii to act wrongly when sent as ambassadors to Gaul, and by means of what they did excited the Gauls to make war in Rome, then ordained that in Rome nothing worthy of the Roman people should be done to meet their attack. For first it brought about that Camillus, who was the only hope they had in those evil days, should be sent as an exile to Ardea. Then that, when the Gauls were marching on Rome, they did not appoint a dictator, as they had done many times to meet the attack of the Volsci and other enemies in the neighborhood. It also caused them to be weak and to take no particular care in calling up troops, who were so slow in taking up arms that they scarce had time to confront the Gauls on the banks of the Alea, which was but 10 miles from Rome. There the tribunes set up their camp without their accustomed diligence, since they did not inspect the site beforehand, nor surround it with trenches nor stockades, nor take any other precautions, either human or divine. While in preparing for battle, they made their ranks thin and weak, and neither troops nor officers behaved as Roman discipline required. No blood was shed during the battle, because at the first onslaught the Romans ran away, the greater number going to Veii, and the rest retiring on Rome, where they sought refuge in the capital without first going home, whereupon the Senate took so little thought for Rome's defense that, for one thing, they omitted to close the gates, and some of its members fled, while others went with the rest into the capital. Granted, in their defense of the capital, they used some sort of discipline, for they did not pack all the useless people inside, and they got in all the corn they could, so as to be able to stand the siege, while of the useless crowd of old men, women, and children, most fled to the country round about, and the rest stayed in Rome at the mercy of the Gauls. So that no one who had read of what was done so often in years gone by, and were to read what was now being done, would think that they were one and the same people. Having described all the disorders mentioned above, Titus Livy concludes with the remark, "To such an extent does fortune blind the minds of men when she does not want them to oppose the force she is using. Nor can anything be more true than the conclusions Livy draws. Hence men who in this life normally either suffer great adversity or enjoy great prosperity deserve neither praise nor blame, for one usually finds that they have been driven either to ruin or to greatness by the prospect of some great advantage which the heavens have held out, whereby they have been given a chance, or have been deprived of the chance, of being able to act virtuously. Fortune arranges this quite nicely, for when it wants a man to take the lead in doing great things, it chooses a man of high spirits and great virtue, who will seize the occasion it offers him. And in like manner, when she wants a man to bring about a great disaster, it gives precedence to men who will help to promote it, and if anyone gets in the way, it either kills him off or deprives him of all power of doing good. It plainly appears from Livy's evidence that, in order to make Rome greater and to lead it on its future greatness, fortune decided it was necessary first to chastise it in a way that will be described at length in the beginning of the next book, but did not want to ruin it altogether. Hence we see that it made an exile of Camillus, but did not cause him to die, that it caused Rome to be taken, but not the capital, that it arranged matters so that nothing useful was thought of to help Rome, nor anything overlooked that could help it in the defense of the capital. It brought it about that, since Rome was to be taken, the greater part of the troops which were routed at Alea should go on to Veii, thus leaving the city without any men to defend it. But in arranging things thus, it also prepared the way for Rome's recovery. For since there was a Roman army at Veii, and Camillus was at Ardea, it became possible to make a more vigorous attempt to deliver the fatherland under a general whose career was free from the stain of defeat, and whose reputation was untarnished. In confirmation of this, one might adduce further examples from modern times, but I do not think this necessary, so pass them over, since that I have given should be enough to satisfy anybody. I assert once again, as a truth to which history as a whole bears witness, that men may second their fortune, but cannot oppose it, that they may weave its warp, but cannot break it, yet they should never give up, because there is always hope, though they know not the end, and move towards it along roads which cross one another, and as yet are unexplored. And since there is hope, they should not despair, no matter what fortune brings, or in what travail they find themselves. 30. Really powerful republics and princes do not purchase alliances with money, but obtain them by means of their virtue and the reputation of their forces. The Romans were being besieged in the capital, and though they expected help from the Veii and from Camillus, were in such a bad case owing to the famine that they came to terms with the Gauls and agreed to pay them so much gold. They were weighing out the gold agreed upon when Camillus arrived with his army, whereupon fortune, says the historian, decided that the Romans should not by purchase save their lives. This kind of thing is not only noticeable in this case, but characterizes the behavior of this republic throughout. We never find the Romans purchasing towns or paying in order to obtain peace. They always acquire both by virtue of their arms. Nor do I think that it has ever happened in the case of any other republic. Among other indications of the power of a strong state, one looks to the terms on which it lives with its neighbors. When it is so governed that, to obtain its friendship, its neighbors become its tributaries, it is a sure sign that the state is powerful. But when the said neighbors, though inferior in strength, extract payment from it, it is a sure sign of its weakness. As one runs runs through Roman history. One sees how the Massilians, the Aedui, the Rhodians, the hero of Syracuse, king of Eumenes, and king of Massinissa, who were neighbors with estates bordering on the Empire of Rome, were ready to incur expense and pay tribute in order to obtain the friendship of Rome, and in return ask only for her protection. In weak states, one finds just the opposite. To begin with, in our own state, Florence, in times past, when its reputation stood its highest, there was no lord in the Romagna who did not receive payment from it. It also made grants to the Perugians, the Castellani, and all its other neighbors. Had this city been armed and strong, everything would have been just the contrary, for to secure its protection, many states would have paid money to it, and would have sought to purchase its friendship, not to sell their own. Nor are the Florentines the only people who have thus demeaned themselves, since the Venetians and the King of France do the same thing. For the latter, great as his kingdom is, habitually pays tribute to the Swiss and to the King of England. This all comes from depriving the people of arms, and from the fact that this king and the other states mentioned have chosen rather to enjoy the present advantage of being able to despoil their people and of being able to avoid an imaginary rather than a real danger, instead of so acting as to secure their people's goodwill and to make their state happy forever. A malpractice such as this, though it may bring a little temporary quiet, in time becomes the cause of crisis, disaster, and irremediable ruin. It would take too long to relate how often the Florentines, the Venetians, and this kingdom have bought off wars and submitted to an ignominy which the Romans submitted to but once. It would take too long to recount how many towns the Florentines and the Venetians have purchased in which one afterwards saw disorder, and how they failed to protect with steel what gold had purchased. The Romans kept up their standards so long as they remained free, but when they fell under the yoke of the emperors, and the emperors began to behave badly and to prefer the shadow to the sun, they, too, began to make grants sometimes to the Parthians, sometimes to Germany, sometimes to other neighboring peoples, which was the first step towards that great empire's downfall. Such are the inconveniences, then, that arise from depriving your people of arms, and there is a worse trouble, too, for the greater the force of the enemy's attack, the weaker do you find yourself, for he who lives in the aforesaid way treats ill the subjects who reside within his domain, but treats well those who live on its confines, in order to have people well disposed to keep the enemy off. It thus comes about that, in order the better to keep the enemy off, he subsidizes the lords and peoples who are his next-door neighbors, with the result that the states in which he is thus kept going offer a modicum of resistance on the frontiers. But when the enemy has crossed them, no further remedy is available. Such states do not see that their way of proceeding is incompatible with any kind of good order, for it is the heart and the vital parts of the body that have to be strengthened, not its extremities, since without them the body can survive, but if the former be injured, it dies. Yet such states keep unarmed the heart, but arm the hands and the feet. What this lack of order has done for Florence is clear, and may be seen any day. For when an army crosses its frontiers and gets near its hearts, it finds itself without firm remedy. Of it the Venetians also gave proof a few years ago, and if their city had not been girt about by water, it would have been the end of it. In France this experience is not found so frequently, for it is so large a kingdom that it has but few enemies superior to it. Nonetheless, when the English attacked this kingdom in 1513, a whole realm was in trepidation, and the king and everybody else thought that a single defeat would spell ruin to the king and to the state. Very different was it in the case of the Romans, for the nearer the enemy approached to Rome, the greater he found the city's power of resistance to be. When Hannibal invaded Italy, one sees how, after 3 defeats and the death of so many generals and soldiers, it was still able not merely to withstand the enemy, but to win the war. All this comes from having fortified well the heart, but of the extremities it made less account, for of basic importance in this state were the people of Rome, the people known as Latins, the other parts of Italy associated with it and its colonies. Thence came the vast number of soldiers which enabled it to fight, and to hold the whole world. That this is so may be seen from the question asked by Hanno, the Carthaginian, of the messengers who came from Hannibal after the rout at Cannae. Having made much of Hannibal's exploits, they were asked by Hanno whether the Roman people had sent to ask for peace, and whether among the Latins and in its colonies any town had revolted against the Romans. To both questions the answer was in the negative, whereupon Hanno remarked, "This war, then, is still in as full swing as it was at the start." We see from this discourse, and from what I have said in other places, how great is the difference between the procedure of present-day republics and that of ancient republics. We see, too, how, because of this, astonishing acquisitions are made and astonishing losses occur daily. For where men have but little virtue, fortune makes a great display of its power. And since fortune changes, republics and governments frequently change, and will go on changing till someone comes along, so imbued with the love of antiquity that he regulates things in such a fashion that fortune does not, every time the sun turns round, get a chance of showing what it can do. 31. How dangerous it is to put confidence in refugees. It may not be amiss, among other topics, to show how dangerous it is to trust those who have been driven from their country, since this is a matter in which everyone who holds office has to deal. In support, it is possible to adduce a noteworthy case, which Titus Livy cites in his histories, though it lies outside his main topic. When Alexander the Great crossed with his army into Asia, Alexander of Epirus, a relative, in fact his uncle, went with some troops to Italy, having been invited by some Lucanian refugees who had led him to expect that through their mediation he would gain the whole of that country. Relying on their word and on the hopes they aroused, he came to Italy and was put to death by them. For their fellow citizens had promised that, if they would kill him, they might return to their own country. One should reflect, therefore, on the unreliability of agreements and promises made by men who find themselves shut out from their country, because in determining what such men's word is worth, it must be borne in mind that, once they get a chance of returning to their country without your help, they will desert you and turn to others in spite of any promises they may have had for you. While in regard to the vain promises and hopes, so intense is their desire to get back home that they naturally believe much that is false, and artfully add so much more, so that between what they believe and what they say they believe, they fill you with a hope which is such that if you rely on it, either you incur an expense in vain or take up what will ruin you. I propose to let this example of Alexander suffice, conjoined with that of Themistocles the Athenian, who, having been proclaimed a rebel, sought refuge with Darius in Asia, to whom he promised so much if he would but attack Greece that Darius resolved to do so. When later he was unable to fulfill these promises, whether out of shame or for fear of punishment, Themistocles poisoned himself. Wherefore, if so eminent a man as Themistocles made this mistake, how much more likely are those to err who are less virtuous and let themselves be swayed by their desire and their passions? A ruler, therefore, should be slow to take up an enterprise because of what some exile has told him, for more often than not all he will get out of it is shame or most grievous harm. And because the taking of towns by stealth and owing to information supplied by their inhabitants rarely succeeds, it does not seem to me irrelevant to discuss this in the next chapter, as also in how many ways the Romans acquired them. 32. On the various methods used by the Romans in taking towns. Since the Romans were all keen on war, and they always and on all occasions took advantage of anything, alike in the matter of expense and of any other matter, that promised to help, it was for this reason that they took care not to besiege the towns they took, for they thought this method so costly and so clumsy that its disadvantages would much more than counterbalance the advantages likely to accrue from the conquest. Hence they deemed it better and more useful to subjugate towns by any other means rather than lay siege to them, so that in all their wars and in all the years they took, there are very few instances of their having used siege. In order to get a hold of a city, therefore, the Romans either took it by assault or got it to surrender. Their assaults were either carried out openly in strength and with violence, or by force conjoined with fraud. When storming a town openly, they used two methods. Either they attacked it on all sides without first demolishing the walls, which is called putting a crown round the city, since the whole army surrounds it and engages it at all points, and in this way they often succeeded in taking a city, even a very large one, at the first assault, as Scipio took New Carthage in Spain. Or when an attack failed, they sent about breaking down the walls with rams and other siege implements, or made a sap by which they attained entrance to a city, as was done when Veii was taken. Or to get on a level with those defending the walls, they constructed wooden towers, or raised earthenworks against the walls from without, so as to be at the same height as the defenders. Against such assaults, the city's defenders in the first case, where the attack came from all sides, were more quickly exposed to danger and had more dubious remedies. For since many defenders were needed everywhere, either those they had were not enough to provide them all with the reserves and reliefs, or, if they could, not all were equally courageous in resisting, and if a section shirked the battle, all was lost. Hence it often happened, as I have said, that this method proved successful, but when the first assault was not successful, they did not keep it going long, because this was too dangerous for the army, for since it covered so much ground, it could as a whole resist but feebly a sortie made by those within. The troops, too, got out of hand and grew weary, but for just once, when it was unexpected, they would try this method. When a breach was made in the walls, it was countered by means of ramparts as at the present time, and to counteract a sap, they made a countersap through which they got at the enemy either with weapons or by other devices, of which one consisted of barrels filled with feathers, to which they applied a light, and when burning, put them in the sap so that the smoke and the stench might prevent the enemy from getting through. While if attacked from the towers, they tried to destroy them by fire, and if from earthworks, they made a hole in the lower part of the wall on which the earthworks was leaning, and drew in the earth which those outside had put there, so that since the earth was being piled up outside and being taken away from the inside, the earthwork did not grow. Such methods of storming a town could not be kept up for long, so they had either to raise their camp or to devise other methods of winning the war, as Scipio did when he got to Africa, for when he attacked Utica he did not succeed in taking it. He raised his camp and sought to engage the Carthaginian armies and break them, or they would have recourse to a siege, as they did at Veii, Capua, Carthage, Jerusalem, and other towns which they took by means of sieges. The acquiring of towns by furtive violence is illustrated in the case of Paelopolis, which the Romans took by arrangement with fifth columnists inside. This form of attack has often been tried by the Romans and by other peoples, but has seldom succeeded. The reason is that at the smallest setback the plan breaks down, and such setbacks easily happen. For in the first place, the conspiracy may be discovered before it comes to a head, and in discovering it there is not much difficulty, owing sometimes to the treachery of those who have been told of it, sometimes to practical difficulties. For you must get in touch with the enemy, with whom it is not permitted to speak unless you can find some excuse, and should the plot not be discovered while arrangements are being made, a host of difficulties occur when the time comes for action. For if you arrive before the time appointed, or get there late, something may upset the plot. So too, if there occurs some unexpected noise, such as the geese made at the Capitol, or if the normal course of events is interrupted, given the least blunder or the smallest mistake, the attack is bound to fail. In addition to which, there is the darkness of the night to add to the fear of those engaged in such dangerous tasks, and the fact that most of the men who are taken on such expeditions, having had no experience of the country or of the place to which they are being led, may get muddled and faint-hearted, or upset by some tiny accidental mishap, and any false impression is enough to make them turn tail. Anyone more lucky in such stealthy nocturnal ventures than Aratus the Sicyonian is not to be found. Yet, bold as he was in these, he was equally nervous about ventures in daylight and in the open. This we may put down to some occult virtue with which he was endowed, rather than to anything in the nature of nocturnal expeditions, which makes them more fortunate than others. Though such means are frequently planned, therefore, but few arrive at fruition, and very few succeed. When towns are acquired by surrender, the surrender may either be voluntary or compulsory. When voluntary, it is due either to some external circumstance which compels a town to seek protection under another's wings, as Capua sought Rome's, or to the desire to be well ruled, a desire evoked by the good government exercised by the prince in question over those who of their own accord have placed themselves in his hands, as was the case with the Rhodinians, the Massilians, and other cities which surrendered to the Roman people. When the surrender is compulsory, it is either brought about by a long siege, as we have said above, or it is due to continued vexation, produced by raids, depredations, and other annoyances, to escape which a city surrenders. Of all the methods mentioned above, the Romans used the last more than any. For more than 450 years they sought to tire out their neighbors by defeats in the field and by raids, and by means of treaties managed to acquire greater repute than their rivals did, as we have pointed out elsewhere. It was on this method that they always relied most, though they tried them all, but found the others fraught with danger or of no use. For sieges are long and costly, assaults of doubtful issue and risky, and conspiracies are unreliable. They also realized that, if the enemy's army was routed, they acquired a kingdom in a day, whereas if they besieged an obstinate city, it might take years to get it. 33. The Romans gave to army commanders discretionary powers. If one is to profit from the perusal of Livy's history, one ought, I think, to take account of all the modes of procedure used by the people in the Senate of Rome. And among other points worthy of notice, there is the authority we find them giving to their consuls, dictators, and other army commanders when in the field. It was of a very high order, for the Senate reserved to itself only the power to initiate fresh wars and to confirm peace treaties. All else was left to the discretion and the power of the consuls. For when the people and the Senate had decided to go to war, against the Latins, for instance, they left everything else to the discretion of the consul, who could either give battle or not give it, and attack this or that town as he thought fit. This is confirmed by numerous examples, but especially by what occurred in an expedition against the Tuscans. The consul, Fabius, had defeated those who were near Sutrium, and was planning next to lead his army through the Ciminian forest en route for Tuscany. About this, not only did he not consult the Senate, but he did not even inform them, though the war was to be carried on in a new, unexplored, and dangerous country. Further confirmation is afforded by the action the Senate here took, which was of the opposite kind, for when they heard of the victory which Fabius had gained, and wondered whether his next step would be to pass through the said forest into Tuscany, they thought it best not to run the risk this war would entail, and so sent 2 legates to Fabius to stop him from going on to Tuscany. But when they arrived, he had already got there and had won a victory, so that instead of preventing a war, the legates came home bringing news of a conquest and of glory won. Whoever considers carefully this technique will see that it was very wise to make use of it, for if the Senate had required a consul in conducting a war to proceed step by step according as they directed, it would have made him less circumspect and slower to act, for it would have seemed to him that the glory of victory would not be wholly his, but that the Senate would share in it, since it would have been carried out under its discretions. Furthermore, the Senate would have had to advise on matters of which it had no immediate cognizance, for though the senators were all men of considerable experience in military matters, yet, as they were not on the spot, they could not be acquainted with the multitudinous details which it is essential to know before one can give sound advice, and so would have made numerous mistakes. This being so, they preferred that the consul should decide what to do, and that the glory should be wholly his, for they thought his actions would be so restrained and regulated by his love of glory that he would do his utmost. To this I have the more willingly called attention, because I notice that the republics of today, such as the Venetian and the Florentine republics, act differently, for if their generals, administrators, or commissioners have to set up a piece of artillery, they want to know of it and to advise about it, a procedure as praiseworthy as others are of that ilk, which together have brought us to our present pass. So, you made it to the end. Is your heart racing? Mine was, right up until a baby zombie stopped it. Having thus resurrected myself into a new life in order to keep reading, the third and final portion of the Discourses will be next Saturday. With luck, by then I'll figure out how to not read like I'm running out of time.